cases. They rejected vaccination, and they urged the people to pray to fight COVID. Also, the government doesn't publish any statistics on COVID, partly it says because it doesn't need to, being, so the president has been claiming, free from the virus. However, the president now appears to be changing the official line, and with more on this, the BBC's Abu Bakr Famau joins us from Dar es Salaam. So what is the evidence? What was this speech that appears to be a change in tone?
Actually, this happened yesterday when the president was addressing, faithfuls at a local church here in Dar es Salaam. And while talking to them, first of all, he appealed, to the people to continue taking precautionary measures. That is, including social distancing and all that. Also emphasizing on the use of the traditional herbs. But again, he told, the public that his government has never stopped anyone from wearing masks. So this simply shows that the government now is taking a different line, because all along the president was seen bluffing, people who are using, people who are using masks and all that. And I will tell you something, within a very short time, this statement has made a great difference in the public. Yeah,
really, what have you seen? That is interesting. What difference has it made?
It has made difference, because now we see, some officials are wearing masks. People have responded very positively on this announcement, but also some, government parastatals have started making announcement, of the availability of locally, produced masks. And that is what the president had emphasized, that it's okay to wear a mask, but he was at least recommending, those locally produced here in the country. So I would say the response has been overwhelming and very positive.
What do we think about the business of, for example, releasing statistics, using vaccine, things which are standard pretty much everywhere else in the world, but aren't in Tanzania? We've had the World Health Organization basically begging Tanzania to sort of scale up public health measures and prepare for vaccination campaign. Any word on that? Has the president moved towards, I suppose, what you could call the global consensus in those elements, or not?
No, so far nothing from the government. However, we've seen, as we've just mentioned, that even the World Health Organization had rated its call on the government. To start again issuing, public, statistics and data of those affected and the number of deaths and all that. But until now, the government has not said anything. But with the pressure, the mounting pressure coming from this organization, maybe at a later stage, maybe the government will start issuing again the statistics. But we don't know until now.
So up until now, it's basically been we've had 3 days of prayer as a major part of the government policy to deal with the virus.
Precisely, and these 3 days ended yesterday, because they started on Friday, Saturday, and the climax was yesterday. So we will hear again, because we will hear from the president if the prayers have been answered or not. Last year, when the country conducted 3 days of prayers again, he came out and said God has answered our prayers. So we don't know if this time again the prayers will be answered or not.
Many thanks indeed. Once again, Abu Bakr Famau on the line from Dar es Salaam on that issue of tracking the data behind coronavirus. I really recommend, if you have time today, go and read an article on the Africa page of the BBC News website on the data gap. It's basically called Measuring the Cost of Not Counting the Dead. It's basically raising the issue that we were talking about last week on this programme about the statistics and how the statistics don't necessarily give us the right idea of what is going on across the continent. It's really, really well researched from right across the continent. Your country will be there. I think really, really recommend that on the BBC News website. Give it a look.
And coming up, we're also going to be looking at school children abductions following the latest abductions in Kagare in central Nigeria. That is the focus of the Africa Daily podcast, so we'll give you a sneak preview of that as well. But let's stay in Africa and Ivory Coast, because in the past half century, the country has seen one of the highest rates of deforestation in the world. That is according to the government there. The 16 million hectares of forest in 1960 is now just over 2 million hectares of forest, with land taken over by agriculture, the mainstay of the economy, of course, which relies on cocoa. Well, now there is this agribusiness company in the country that has just signed a deal with a satellite company to help map deforestation from the sky and try to stop it. So it can be achieved with the use of this aerospace technology. Let's talk to Joel Eric Missain-Hoon, an economist at Afriksearch. Welcome to Newsday. It's a huge problem, so tell us about this deal. What's been struck?
Good morning. I think this deal is very interesting because, as you know, Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, has been based its economy and growth development on agriculture since 1960. And CIFCA is the main employer on this country. Is activity is based also on agribusiness. And it's very interesting that this company, which has been basing its growing economy business on agriculture, is now trying to fight and reverse this deforestation. And
yes, so you could argue that they maybe have split loyalties. And this company, which has palm oil, sugar, rubber plantations, the fact that it's stepping forward to say, well, we need to stop the decline of the forest in this way, I mean, that's pretty significant, isn't it? So what are they going to hopefully find out, and how is it going to change matters?
I think it's going to change because people have been talking about deforestation since. But the thing is that one farmer alone cannot do that. And you need the partnership between state, private sector, and technical structure and companies like the intelligence that is working with the CIFCA. And I think that this is very, very new, and this is maybe the chance to be able to change this deforestation.
How will it actually change matters, though? Because as you pointed out, if you're a farmer, and I know where you grow cocoa, coffee, pineapple, massive exports around the world of those products. If you're a farmer, you have your own plantation. You're thinking about how you live. I mean, would there be any risk to individual incomes through this? How is it going to map out in the future?
Exactly. If you're a farmer, you just think about your incomes, the way you're going to feed your family and pay for the school fees of your children. But if you're a big company like CIFCA, you have the financial power to do that. And of course, CIFCA has been helped in this project with Proparco, which is the French financing agency. So the partnership between Proparco, the tech startup, and CIFCA will give them the strength to really tackle this deforestation. And when we see what is happening today in Texas, I really think that it's in also the benefit of the whole world that we really start to do something against this deforestation.
Listen, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you so much for the update. Joel Eric Missain-Hoon, he's an economist at Afriksearch.
This is Newsday from the BBC, 18 minutes to the hour, which means it's time for the sport. James Gregg.
Yes, a busy sporting weekend all over the world, Lawrence, but not least across Africa. Ugandan sports presenter Usha Komagisha is in Monastir in Tunisia. Well, she is busy because she was covering the Afrobasket qualifiers, which I'll come on to with her in just a moment. But first, Usha is going to talk to me about another important African sporting event, the Under-20s Africa Cup of Nations, which has included some very famous surnames.
Beautiful to see the sons of legends, in there trying to also start their own legacies. You have Enzo Chato, who is the son of Bill Chato, and he's actually playing the same position like Bill Chato for Cameroon. So, the people from Cameroon, they're very happy with that. And then you have Etienne Eto'o, who everyone was questioning his inclusion in the team, but he scored a brace against Mozambique just to show his quality, and that he's also going to, write his own story as a player. Played an incredible role in Cameroon qualifying for the quarterfinals, and it's just good to see.
What stage are we at of the competition now? And what are the main highlights and takeaways from it, Usha?
So we have the last group games. You have Ghana and Gambia, and Morocco playing against Tanzania, but that's already, I should say, a gone case because Ghana and Morocco are already qualified, I should say. My highlights would be, of course, Uganda qualifying for the quarterfinals as a first-time competitors. It's been a long journey from when we were banned for bringing on over-edge players, but also, the bigger names as usual, Cameroon, but also seeing Morocco taking part at this level. And obviously the Gambia, they've been trying to redevelop their youth system and get back to, success at the big tournaments.
You're a very busy sports broadcaster, Usha. I know that you've also been keeping an eye across the AfroBasket qualifiers, of course, for the tournament proper in Rwanda later on this year. What about Nigeria, first of all? You posted some great footage on your Twitter account. Just listen to that noise from the Nigerians celebrating. I mean, they're a real force. I mean, who else has qualified? But Nigeria is so impressive, by the way.
Well, Nigeria have always been impressive. They have incredible, talented players across the globe because of who they are as a country. We're talking about 200 plus million people as Nigerians, but also a lot of them being born in Nigeria, in the USA, in Australia, in Europe, and then, coming together to qualify for the AfroBasket, which is going to be a show and the very, very first time that we have this tournament after 4 years, because before it was every other year. The other teams that have qualified are the usual big dogs. You have Tunisia, you have Egypt, you have the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, you have Rwanda, Mali, South Sudan, first timers, and the usual names, I should say, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, which is Ivory Coast. Before I forget, Kenya. Kenya's qualified for the very first time since 1993. Big one for the Morans, and very happy for them.
All the big dogs and also some of the little dogs, if you will, as well. And also, finally, a word, you mentioned Kenya. What about Liz Mills? She's the first female head coach of Kenya's men's basketball team. She's not actually the first female head coach to coach an African nation, is she? But let's just talk about what an amazing story that is, and is it something that we can grow to expect?
Yes, it's actually amazing to see that Liz Mills has come this far. It's been quite a journey for her, all the way from when she was coaching in Zambia. She's been part of Cameroon once in a while. She's paid her dues with the Patriots of Rwanda, who are going to play in the Basketball Africa League, the inaugural edition. And she's gained a lot of experience. She's been following a lot of basketball in Africa. And following it, you can see her tweets on social media and what she tries to do and analyze, and also really set the pace for other women coaches in Africa to go on and challenge themselves and look for a platform where they can work. And so that you're in a space where people are saying you're doing a good job, not just because she's a woman, but yes, you're doing the job the right way and everyone can appreciate. So I'm very, very happy for her at her level, and it's important to know that the Kenyan players, they trust her, they believe in her, and they trust her expertise.
Usha, thanks so much for talking to us on Newsday. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Usha Komagisha there talking to me from Monastir. Full look at everything sports-wise from around the world from the weekend next hour here on Newsday.
James, thank you very much. Indeed, you are listening to Newsday from the BBC World Service. Now, last week we were reporting here on the programme about the abduction of 42 people from a school in Kagare in central Nigeria. All of those taken, including 27 children, are still missing. And of course, it isn't the first time we've had a report on stories like this. So for today's episode of Africa Daily, our new podcast, Alan Kasuja has been taking a closer look at school children abductions in the country.
What do you think when you look back on your school days? I remember them like it was yesterday. There were a few ups and downs, sure, but mostly what I remember is that feeling of safety, of happiness, without much of a worry in the world. So when I look at the news of the last few days, I do wonder whether children in Nigeria can say the same thing. Cast your mind back to 2014, I'm sure you'll remember all the headlines about the Chibok girls, the 200 or so students that were abducted by Boko Haram militants. There's been more of those stories since then, quite a few more, in fact. And as you'd imagine, that's making people nervous. Some say these abductions are becoming more widespread, which is why today I'm asking, why are kids being kidnapped in Nigeria? So there's been 2 abductions in the space of about 2 months. They've also raised eyebrows because they've happened in places where Boko Haram isn't particularly active. As you may know, they're more likely to be found in the northeast of Nigeria. So is something different going on here? I wasn't sure, so I got my team to link me up with Bulama Bukarti. He's a Nigerian security analyst at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Was he surprised by where these latest attacks took place?
It would surprise casual observers, but not me. And we are not sure whether Boko Haram is the group responsible for this particular kidnapping. But even if it is, it wouldn't surprise me. Since January 2020, I have been flagging how Boko Haram is building a cell in Niger State where this incident happened. And about 6 months ago, we did see a video from Boko Haram showing about 200 members who claim to be from Niger State, from the forest. This particular area, the north central part of Nigeria and the northwest where the December incident happened, is over 500 miles away from Boko Haram's base in the northeastern part of Nigeria. And even during its heydays around 2014, 2015, Boko Haram never had a cell in the north central or the northwest.
So is it safe to say that we don't know who's responsible for these latest kidnappings?
Some would say bandits, others would say Boko Haram, but even the difference between bandits and Boko Haram is becoming more and more blurred, because the original difference was that Boko Haram is an ideological group that claims to fight for Islam and to install Islamic system of governance in their domain. Bandits used to be criminals who are economically motivated, but in the last 18 months or so, Boko Haram started actively trying to infiltrate the criminal groups in the northwest and the north central. And there is evidence that they have succeeded, and therefore you could say there could be some ideological elements to what we see in the northwest and the north central now. And that's the dangerous bit when it comes to the criminals and the bandits in the northwest and the north central. People who have killed 9,000 people in the last 10 years in the northwest are now being infiltrated by people that might give them a moral justification for their crimes and for their loot.
You know, I've covered this story a lot, and of course, understanding the security situation is important. But man, as a father, I just can't ignore the fact that the victims of these attacks, the people being abducted, are children, and how the parents must feel. After the kidnappings in Kankara in December, the BBC spoke to parents at the school. This woman was saying her child and her younger brother were taken by the gunmen. She said she'd been waiting at the school since dawn, but there were no updates for them. She said they were terrified. But why kidnap children? Why are children, of all people, being taken?
I think there are several reasons. Number one, children are a very good material Boko Haram and criminals have understood for propaganda. When the Chibok girls incident happened 6 years ago, they saw the kind of international outrage and media attention they caused. And that's what is called the propaganda of the deed. Terrorists are happy with that kind of situation. The second is that because of the political pressure governments face when children are attacked, the government are forced to pay money, to pay a ransom. And therefore, the criminals and terrorists understand that they could extort money out of government or communities when children are involved. Number three, children are a very easy target. They are the softest target you can ever find. And schools in Nigeria, unfortunately, are very porous and unsafe. And therefore, it is very easy for them to walk into schools and do whatever they want, including just walking away with the whole student body.
I remember when Buhari became president, a lot of people were optimistic. They thought criminality and the threat posed by Boko Haram were finally going to be addressed. I asked Bulama whether he felt anything had been achieved.
I mean, I was one of those who were very optimistic. I campaigned for Buhari with every fiber of my body and with my money and everything. And I got arrested several times by the former administration. And the key reason for most Nigerians was security. That was one of Buhari's 3 campaign promises. And Buhari did succeed in the first 2 years of his administration. Boko Haram was dislodged and pushed to the fringes of the Lake Chad region. Many of their fighters were killed, but then the administration declared victory prematurely. In December of 2015, Buhari declared that Boko Haram had been technically defeated, whatever that means. And what we saw was Boko Haram now rebuilding and striking back with more sophistication and lethality. And that's what we have been observing since 2018.
Alan Kasuja there and the Africa Daily team taking a look at children being abducted from schools in Nigeria. Of course, that last abduction happened in Kagara. You can hear more if you want to hear a more in-depth look at all of that. You just have to download the Africa Daily podcast from wherever you get your usual podcast from.
5 minutes to the hour. Let's talk about South Sudan. A year since the formation of the unity government, the latest power-sharing deal between President Salva Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar. It was supposed, of course, to end violence and rebuild the state after 5 years of bloodshed, hundreds of thousands of deaths and people displaced both internally and elsewhere. But the unity government appears to be in trouble. We're going to look at this in detail now with Nicola Mandil, a journalist based in Juba, who we often turn to for analysis of these things. So, Nicola, 1 year on, what has and what hasn't been implemented from the peace deal agreed?
Well, thank you, Lawrence. 1 year on, indeed, as you have said, a lot of things are still hanging in the balance. For example, the formation of the unity government took place 1 year ago, as you have rightly said, but a lot of benchmarks are still not yet achieved. For example, the reconstitution of the National Legislative Assembly is not done. The formation of a unified national army, which is supposed to be 83,000 forces, is not yet done because the parties to the peace agreement have no unified command. So still, the forces are not graduated. They're still in the training camp. They still face some challenges. Although the government at the national level, at the top level, the presidency and the cabinet have been formed, but the legislature is not yet formed. A lot of things are still, as far as the revitalized transitional government of national unity is concerned.
Is the government, actually able to do much governing? Because the humanitarian needs and the food insecurity problems are so great. Is it the government that is trying to deal with those problems, or are they relying on international donors and NGOs?
Well, humanitarian agencies, of them, they are trying to help save lives in this time. As you know, many people are projected to be food insecure in 2021. So the government alone cannot do anything. So South Sudan is surviving at the mercy of some of these humanitarian agencies. As you know, there are millions of people who will face hunger in this year as projected by some UN agencies.
Yeah, something like 60%, I think, is the prediction of food insecure people in South Sudan. In terms of the politics behind this, we are so used to each side blaming the other. Is it a matter of equal blame on both sides, or is one of the parties sort of trying to obstruct the deal or not delivering what they should do? Give us that background.
Well, the peace process is always like that, full of blame games, especially given the situation of South Sudan. The SPLM in the government, the SPLM in opposition, they like blaming each other. But now I think there is no room for blame game because both of them are in the government now. Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, they form a unity government 1 year ago today. So there should be no room for blame. They should really implement the peace agreement so that the people of South Sudan feel the peace, that there is real peace, but there's no room for blame game. Otherwise, they have to really implement the peace, because ahead of them, very important benchmark remains, elections. Any delay now might delay the election, and that will frustrate the people of South Sudan.
Well, listen, many thanks indeed for your thoughts, Nicola Mandil, journalist based in Juba. We're going to be, we hope, if we can establish the line, talking to a government minister later in the programme. If you can stay with us. This is Newsday, BBC World Service. Lawrence and Claire with you. Stay tuned. News up next, then more from us.
This is the BBC World Service, and for March's World Book Club, Harriet Gilbert discusses a literary first.
Cici Dangarembwo was the first black woman in Zimbabwe to have a book published in English. Nervous Conditions explores themes of race, class and gender through the story of one ambitious young girl. I'll be joined by Cici to learn more about her prize-winning novel.
World Book Club from the 6th of March. And at 8:30 GMT, Business Daily.
Zero carbon electricity is easy. We've got solar, wind and nuclear. Note, the real climate change challenge will be finding emission-free ways to make steel, cement and fertiliser, and to power ships and trucks. So could hydrogen be the explosive answer?
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to Newsday from the BBC World Service with Lawrence Pollard and Claire McDonnell.
Hello. Hundreds of thousands of people in Myanmar take to the streets on what is shaping up to be the biggest general strike yet against the military as calls for further international intervention increase.
The COVID death toll in the USA is inching towards a grim milestone, 500,000. We'll hear the memories of some of the bereaved, the real people behind the statistics.
My grandpa was just such a character, you can tell from reading the obituary. I would say he was really someone that, he wanted to see and be seen. He was definitely the man of the hour.
Friends of Princess Latifa call for sanctions against the Emirati of Dubai for allegedly holding her hostage. Her best friend, with her at the time of the alleged abduction, will join us live.
And we'll go to Australia as it launches its public rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine. After the latest stories.
Hello, I'm Neil Nunes with the BBC News. Thousands of people in Myanmar have once again taken to the streets as people observe a general strike in protest at the army takeover earlier this month. Long lines of people marched into Yangon and other cities, with volunteer guards in yellow construction helmets keeping them in order. Jonathan Head has this report.
A chilling warning broadcast on state television that young people would pay with their lives if they continued to take part in the civil disobedience movement appears to have done little to deter the demonstrators. Aside from the ubiquitous pictures they carry of the detained civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi, there are also posters showing photos of the 3 protesters killed when police opened fire, 2 of them over the weekend. It isn't clear how the authorities will respond to this strike, or if that's even possible, with such huge numbers of protesters.
The British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab will today call on Myanmar's generals to release the country's elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi. In a speech to the UN Human Rights Council, he'll say the democratic wishes of the people of Myanmar must be respected. The Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has welcomed an announcement by NATO that it has made no final decision on the withdrawal of its troops from Afghanistan. Speaking to the BBC, Mr. Ghani said NATO's move would provide an opportunity to accelerate the peace process with the Taliban.
We have a sense of urgency. We have put a lot of things on the table. We've done a lot, and we've sacrificed a tremendous amount. It is time that Taliban and their supporters show the same will for seeking peace as they've demonstrated in seeking conflict.
The U.S. plane maker Boeing has recommended suspending flights of its 777 aircraft powered by Pratt & Whitney 4000 engines until an inspection protocol is in place. An engine of this type caught fire and came off a United Airlines flight near Denver, Colorado on Saturday. The International Committee of the Red Cross says the needs of the people affected by fighting in the Ethiopian region of Tigray are overwhelming. Dominic Stillart, the ICRC's Director of Operations, told the BBC the humanitarian response needed to be scaled up urgently.
Our teams are reporting that they are constantly taken aback by the needs they are discovering on the ground. The food security situation becomes extremely tense. The people in Tigray, they essentially lost the harvest season because of the fighting that's been going on. There are serious issues with regards to access to medical care.
World News from the BBC. The White House says President Biden will attend a candle-lighting ceremony at sundown on Monday, once officials confirm that the number of people who have died with COVID-19 in the U.S. has passed 500,000. Health authorities have reported decreases in new coronavirus cases and hospitalizations over the last few weeks, but they've warned it's essential to keep safety measures to prevent another catastrophic surge. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is expected to announce today that all schools in England will reopen on the 8th of March as part of his wider roadmap to ease coronavirus lockdown restrictions. Mr. Johnson, who was accused of acting too late and relaxing curbs too early last year, has said he'll lay out a cautious but irreversible plan to ensure no more lockdowns in England. Curators at the National Museum of Norway have solved a lingering question about Edvard Munch's painting The Scream. The museum's 1893 version of the picture has some graffiti in the top left-hand corner, which reads, "Can only have been painted by a madman." Our arts editor, Will Gumpertz, picks up this story.
It is a long-standing mystery that has now been solved with a combination of new technology and old-fashioned detective skills. Infrared scans enabled curators to see the faint penciled scrawl much more clearly, allowing them to compare it to the handwritten text of their prime suspect, against which they duly discovered a clear match, revealing the culprit to be none other than the artist himself. The curators say that Munch wrote the text in 1895, 2 years after he completed the picture, in an ironic response to a young medical student who had questioned the artist's mental state when the painting was first exhibited in Oslo.
Will Gumpertz with that report. That's the latest BBC World News.
Many thanks indeed for the latest. In just a moment, we're going to get the latest on the ongoing general strike and protests in Myanmar. Also, we talk about vaccines and viruses in Africa, Ebola back in Guinea, this time, of course, in the middle of the coronavirus outbreak, and also talking about the vaccine rollout. What is the bottleneck for Africa? Is it the logistics? Well, probably not in a country that's rather used to mass vaccination, or is it maybe getting hold of the vaccine that's more of the problem? And also, we hear from Armenia, calls for the Prime Minister to resign after the battle with the war with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. We hear of calls for civil disobedience. All that coming up. Plus, James Gregg has got the sport. We talk to a friend of Princess Latifa, the daughter of Dubai's ruler, Sheikh Maktoum, in the wake of that BBC documentary about her disappearance, it would appear. And also, we got the business with Andrew Wood. All that coming up here on Newsday.
Let's start in Myanmar, because, of course, we look at social media this morning will show hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets in a mass protest of civil disobedience on this general strike day. Cities across the country, people pouring out onto the streets. They are anti-coup protesters. The Myanmar military has warned that they could die, but it hasn't stopped them. They are back out on the streets with tensions soaring over the deaths of 4 demonstrators so far. The civil disobedience movement in the country is also calling on its supporters to observe this general strike in protest over the military coup. Meanwhile, there's more diplomatic pressure from abroad, namely from the US, the UK and the EU, sending warnings against violations of human rights. The UK Foreign Secretary today will give a speech to the UN He's talking to the UN Human Rights Council, and he will call for the military to step aside and for Aung San Suu Kyi to be released from house arrest. Well, earlier I caught up with Wai Nu, human rights activist and former political prisoner in Myanmar. She's currently based in the US, over in Washington, D.C.
You know, the protests are growing day by day, and yesterday there were a brutal crackdown in Mandalay and, across the country. The other day in Nijina and in Naypyidaw, we have growing number of people being shot dead, killed, and people at night, the military raid at night, really brutal behavior against people at night, and growing number of arrests and intimidation threat by the military, by deploying like the most notorious military division, light infantry divisions. Despite of all of this background, intimidation, threat, and the announcement by the military, people are going out for protests, and it's growing day by day. And today is the biggest one. So they are calling it for 525 movement, or the spring revolutions of Myanmar. People are not giving up.
A protester in Yangon on Saturday, quoted in the British press, is saying this could be our last revolution. It depends not just on civilian power, though, but also outside help from the UN and the US in particular. And we know that the British Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, will give a speech today to the UN Human Rights Council and say the UK demands that the military step aside. How crucial are those kind of speeches in what may play out in Myanmar?
Now we are requiring the diplomatic actions, economic actions, and security actions. We need, at this point, to use all available tools. From the UN Security Council, we are urging Security Council to reconvene immediately and send a monitoring and mediating body to Myanmar so that we can find ways in these situations, mitigate the heat between the military and the Aung San Suu Kyi leadership. I mean, that is for immediate approach to ease the situations and to return the power to the elected government. On the other hand, we're also asking for global arms embargo and a collective international sanctions, economic sanctions against the military and military's businesses. The US and UK declare some sanctions, but it's not enough. We need to really touch into the heart of the military's businesses, including the sanctions against Myanmar Economic Holding Limited and Myanmar Economic Enterprise.
So what you're saying is, even though we are seeing incredible pictures of hundreds of thousands of people across the country taking to the streets right now, you say without those concrete measures from the international community that go further than they've ever done before, it doesn't really matter how many people come out of the streets. It will make the civilian uprising alone, you think, won't make a difference in itself.
Civilian will continue to come out until the military step down, and military will only step down when we have a concrete actions from the international communities, especially from the UN Security Council. Condemnations and statement will not work.
That is Wai Nu. She is a human rights activist and former political prisoner in Myanmar. She was speaking to me just a little while ago from Washington, D.C.
12 minutes past the hour. This is Newsday. You can't often predict the news, but I know what we're going to be talking about this time tomorrow, and it's going to be America passing the grim milestone of 500,000 deaths from COVID-19. At the moment, the universally respected and used Johns Hopkins University of Medicine assessment, they collate all the numbers for the whole world. They put the death rate at the moment at 498,883. Rather grimly, I'm sorry, that's gone up since I actually wrote that introduction about 2 hours ago. Throughout the period of COVID-19, the Seattle Times newspaper is one of those that has been running a special obituary series to commemorate those lives lost during the pandemic in their state, in Washington state, so that the dead aren't forgotten. Their journalist, Paige Cornwell, reflects on that.
My name is Paige Cornwell, and I'm a reporter for the Seattle Times, and I have been covering the COVID-19 pandemic since the very first COVID-19 outbreak in the United States at Life Care Center. Lives Remembered is our series about people who have died of COVID-19 in Washington, and so we wanted a way to show people who was being lost and the toll that this was taking.
My name's Pete McGuire, and my mother, Lavelle McGuire, passed away last year at age 94 from COVID-19. My mom was really a lot of fun. She had a lot of energy, and she loved being around her family and her grandkids. My mom was quite adventurous, really, for her time. She grew up during World War II, and she loved to go to the dances, and she was, apparently, it's kind of hard to imagine, but she loved to jitterbug. She and my dad were both pretty socially conscious about a lot of things. One of the things they got involved was they used to bring parts to build these nuclear weapons. They called it the White Train. And so they would go down to the ferry dock with a lot of nuns and priests protesting these nuclear warheads. And one time they even wound up on the news. It was kind of funny.
Amazing grace, how sweet.
I have gone through obituaries every single week of the pandemic to find people who died of COVID-19. And there are some that stand out not because of the sadness, but because there's comedy or there's something light about it.
Humor was probably like seniors' #1 language, through life and through the world. Hi, I'm Katie Dupar, and I'm related to Tom Dupar Sr. He's my grandfather. My grandpa was just such a character, you can tell from reading the obituary. I would say he was really someone that, he wanted to see and be seen. He was definitely the man of the hour. He had like a fire under him to get something done or a goal. Come hell or high water, it was going to get done. Something that's kind of funny is I have a calendar reminder, call grandpa, because my dad's always been really good about call your grandparents. And so I just can't bring myself to delete that from my calendar, call grandpa.
What keeps me going is the response from readers saying thank you for writing about these people.
And so to have those memories and just to be able to think about him and talk about him and share his story and his life, because, he was such a character, and he wasn't for everybody, but he was our character,
Gosh, I do find the little sniff as she remembers her grandpa very moving to hear. That was Paige Cornwell of the paper in Washington State, the Seattle Times, which has been compiling obituaries. And in the background, sadly, we're going to be talking about it in coming hours, I can guarantee you, the passing in America of what will be a grim milestone of 500,000 deaths from COVID-19. This is Newsday from the BBC. On the way, we talk about the vaccine rollout in Australia. We talk about where is Princess Latifah with someone who knows her well or knew her well before she disappeared. And we got the business as well. But first, it's James Gregg with the sport. James.
A huge sporting weekend has just passed us by. Manchester City and Manchester United picked up wins on Sunday in the Premier League. Raheem Sterling says that Manchester City aren't going to be taking their 10-point lead in the Premier League for granted because things can change in an instant. Sterling scored the only goal in yesterday's 1-0 victory over Arsenal. It takes City onto a run winning run of 18 matches, by the way. Meanwhile, Jose Mourinho's job of manager at Tottenham is safe for the moment. That's despite losing a fifth match in 6 at West Ham. And of course, on Saturday, we saw Everton winning at Liverpool for the first time in 22 years. I've got a great guest later on the programme lined up on this. Elsewhere, Inter Milan, they've taken a giant step towards the Serie A title in Italy with a 3-0 win over cross-city rivals AC Milan in the derby. We saw Novak Djokovic, of course, win a 9th Australian Open tennis title too on Sunday. He's now just 2 Grand Slams behind Nadal and Federer for most wins, and I'll do a full sports roundup, well, as possible, in 30 minutes' time, of course, including Afrobasket and AFCON Under-20s right here on Newsday.
Many thanks indeed, James.
Let's give you some business news now. Andrew Wood is at our business desk in Hong Kong. Andrew, quite spectacular pictures over the weekend of parts of a Boeing aeroplane that had landed in somebody's garden in the US. And as a result of this, Boeing has recommended that airlines ground that version of its plane, its 777 passenger jet airliner. Remind us what happened.
Well, the plane was flying from Denver in the United States to Honolulu, also in the United States. Parts of its engine, the engine failed, and then, as you were saying, bits of the engine started falling off, and the plane had to return to Denver. The area, the bits of the jet were found in a residential area. Now Boeing has said that Boeing 777s, it's very particular, Boeing 777s with the Pratt & Whitney 4000 jet, to basically ground them. Now, most of these airlines are America-owned or operated by United Airlines. It's already grounded them, and basically, asked them to look and to ground them until a protocol can be come up with to investigate what went wrong. Now, it's not only jets in America. Most of the rest of the jets are used by Korean and Japanese airlines. So Japan's already asked owners of those jets to avoid Japanese airspace. And we're just waiting really now from the Federal Aviation Administration to hear more what the investigation might be, what they might have found already.
And do we know how many aircraft are likely to be affected?
Well, not that many, because it is a very, very specific type of airline. It's one of the older 777 airliners, and the engine that was used is very unusual because it uses hollow blades, and that's apparently unique to this particular engine and this particular aircraft.
Andrew, thank you for the update. Andrew Wood at our business desk in Hong Kong. More from him later.
This is Newsday from the BBC World Service. It's 20 past the hour. Now, where is Princess Latifa, one of the daughters of Dubai's Sheikh Mohammed Al Maktoum, who has been saying in smuggled videos released to the BBC that she's being held hostage since trying to flee in 2018. Now, there is no story here, according to the royal family. In a statement, they have said Her Highness is being cared for at home, supported by her family and medical professionals. That doesn't cut any ice with our next guest, who is Tina Yauhianen, who was a very good friend of Princess Latifa and was with her when she was taken back by her family in international waters off the coast of Goa in 2018. And she joins us on the line now. Now, Tina, you've been running a campaign to draw attention to what you see as the plight and the imprisonment of the princess. Tell us about what you're now going to do diplomatically. I understand that you're going to try to convince the British Foreign Secretary to do something about this. What's your next move?
Well, it's been definitely a very encouraging week. We've seen many world leaders speaking out. And now, obviously, they have to follow through with what they've said. And it's also going to be a very important week at the UN. We have obviously given them all the transcripts of the videos, and they have already requested a video call with us, like video meeting, to see all the evidence that we are going to give them, which is obviously those recordings.
And which part of the UN is this that you hope might take action?
Well, we are hoping that this will be dealt with, obviously, with all the relevant working groups, as well as the head of UN Human Rights.
So you hope that it'll move ahead to some kind of a vote at the Human Rights Council or something like that. What about the suggestion that the UK takes action against UAE?
Yes, definitely. We've already seen the foreign minister and prime minister and several MPs speaking out. So we are hoping to see more actions from their side these coming days.
What would you
I'm
like?
obviously no politician myself.
Well, I wonder what you would like
them
them to do, because of course what we have to point out is that there are extremely close links of all kinds, economic, security, diplomatic, between the UAE and between the Sheikh Mohammed and the British government and indeed the royal family in many ways. So I think a neutral observer would probably put the chances of anything happening at pretty much round zero, wouldn't they? Or are you more optimistic?
I am definitely more optimistic. We are having the worldwide attention right now, and we also got the attention of U.S. Secretary of State. So I feel we have caught the momentum, and we need to push those decision makers and world leaders to put pressure on Dubai to finally get Latifa out and released.
And we should say, of course, that the videos come from a while back. Where do you think Latifa is now?
I'm extremely worried about my friend. We of course welcome any sort of truthful statement from Dubai that Latifa is safe and well. But for me, it just seems like a desperate PR attempt from their side. And my fear is that Latifa is actually in a very bad state and medicated, or that in the coming days we are going to see forced pictures of Latifa again in Dubai's attempt to cover up the truth. So those are my actual biggest fears.
Right, that's interesting. Otherwise, what is the next move, do you think? What are you looking to as being the next twist in this story?
Well, from our end, we're obviously, as a Free Latifa campaign, we are making plans on what to do next. And obviously, I also wrote to the Queen in attempt to get her intervention as well.
Well, let's see if anything happens. Many thanks indeed for your time talking to us. Tina Jauhianen, who was a very close friend of Princess Latifa, indeed was on the boat with her when she tried to make her escape in 2018 and was hauled back by, I think it was Indian commandos at the time. Many thanks indeed for joining us on Newsday.
Newsday BBC World Service, Claire McDonnell and Lawrence Pollard with you. Let's take you to Australia now, because an 84-year-old Polish migrant has become the first person to receive a COVID-19 vaccination in Australia as long-awaited mass inoculation gets underway. Nursing home residents and staff will be amongst the first to be vaccinated, along with workers at quarantine hotels for returned travellers. Let's talk to the BBC's Phil Mercer in Sydney. So the first person always gets vaccinated. We always remember their name. It was an 84-year-old Polish migrant. So where was he exactly, Phil?
It was a she, actually. It was Jane Malziak. Yes, she is going down in history as the first person in Australia to receive the vaccine developed by Pfizer. She's 84 years of age, and she moved to Australia from post-war Poland as a teenager. So her name is now in lights because Australia has begun this mass rollout of COVID-19 vaccines. Health officials pretty optimistic that the vast majority of Australians will get the jab. The figure being suggested is around 85%, if not more, of the population. Alan Cheng is a professor in infectious diseases epidemiology, and he says that the start of the vaccine rollout in Australia is a significant moment.
We're hopeful this is the beginning of the end. There's still a lot of work to do, and it feels like it's taken a long time to get to this starting line. But I think it really gives us hope that this is starting to not be so much of an issue that it has been last year.
So, Phil, what is the government doing to soothe community concerns about the vaccines, including the speed of their development and the rollout?
Well, a number of things, Claire. Firstly, they're spending an awful lot of money on public health campaigns trying to convince the doubters in the community that the vaccines are safe and that they will be monitored very carefully. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was among one of the first people in Australia to be inoculated. He said that the vaccination programme was a game changer that would transform Australia's response to the pandemic. Professor Catherine Bennett is from Deakin University, and she believes that the two drugs that have been approved for use in Australia, the one manufactured by Pfizer and the one developed by AstraZeneca, are both safe.
We've now had nearly 10 times the adult population of Australia equivalent vaccinated around the world, and we're not seeing anything apart from what we anticipated, which was very moderate side effects where you might have a day or two feeling a bit fluey, and that seems to be the extent of it.
Just give us an update then, Phil, on how Australia has managed to contain the virus. How are things going over there?
Australia sees itself as one of the international success stories. Since the pandemic began, Australia has recorded just under 29,000 coronavirus cases. 909 people died, and we understand that there are just 39 active coronavirus cases in Australia. Mass testing, contact tracing, the closure of Australia's international borders and very strict lockdowns have all been key in this strategy. And of course, the government is hoping that the vaccine will provide even more optimism.
Phil, thank you so much for the update. Phil Mercer reporting from Australia. That care resident, Polish immigrant Jane Melisiak. She says, "It's been lovely. I never expected anything like this."
This is the BBC World Service, getting inside the brain of one of the richest people on the planet.
What does it take to earn thousands every single second and amass an estimated fortune of nearly $200 billion?
In some ways, it seems like Jeff was born with a customer gene.
Jeff Bezos is the founder of the world's largest online retailer.
Satisfying customers. That strategy is good for making money.
He can kind of peer into the future and force new things.
Embrace innovation, embrace experimentation, and accept that many of the things you try won't work.
From books to food, from cloud computing to space exploration.
If the world economy and population is to keep expanding, space is the only way to go.
I'm David Baker, and I'll be finding out the secrets of his success.
Inside the brain of Jeff Bezos at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Welcome to Newsday from the BBC World Service with Lawrence Pollard and Claire MacDonald falling over one another to bring you the news.
We just can't wait. Coming up, how past vaccination programmes across the African continent will help with the rollout of COVID-19 inoculations.
We go to South Sudan, speak to the man charged with keeping the peace.
And in an ever-deepening economic crisis in Venezuela, how women's reproductive health is being compromised.
BBC News with Neil Nunes. Large crowds of people have jammed the streets in towns and cities across Myanmar in response to a call for a general strike to protest against the coup. The military has warned protesters they are risking their lives. In Yangon and other cities, demonstrators were accompanied by volunteer guards in yellow construction helmets. Meanwhile, the British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab is to call on Myanmar's generals to release the elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi. In a speech to the United Nations Human Rights Council, he'll say the democratic wishes of the people must be respected, and he'll urge the military to step aside. Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani has welcomed an announcement by NATO that it has made no final decision on the withdrawal of its troops. In an interview with the BBC, Mr. Ghani said it offered an opportunity to accelerate the peace process. Boeing has recommended that dozens of its 777 airliners be grounded over an engine fault which sparked an emergency landing in the U.S. state of Colorado on Saturday. A Pratt & Whitney 4000 engine caught fire and came off a United Airlines flight. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has called on the Biden administration to reopen dialogue to restore relations damaged under the leadership of Donald Trump. Mr. Wang urged Washington to remove unfair tariffs on Chinese goods. The White House says President Biden will attend a candle-lighting ceremony at sundown on Monday, once there's official confirmation that more than 500,000 people in the United States have died with COVID-19. And a national memorial service has been held in New Zealand to mark 10 years since an earthquake in the city of Christchurch. 185 people died. Much of the city centre remains derelict. BBC News.
Many thanks indeed. This is Newsday from the BBC. Those are the headlines, and now come the programme. We've got sport in about 10 minutes' time. But we talk about Guinea coping with a new Ebola outbreak in the middle of the corona pandemic. Also, we talk about the challenges for vaccination across the continent. A year on from the formation of the unity government in South Sudan, what has happened? Why is peace still in the balance? We hear from Venezuela and we hear from Armenia as well. All that coming up in the next half hour.
Let's start in Guinea. In the midst of the battle against coronavirus, the country has declared last week another outbreak of Ebola. Now, that's the first in West Africa since 2016, and today the first batch of vaccines is expected to arrive in Conakry, with hopes that a mass vaccination will soon follow. The Democratic Republic of Congo is also fighting a fresh Ebola outbreak in the east of the country, but this time an effective vaccine and treatments could help halt the spread of the virus in its tracks. Our Africa correspondent, Catherine Barahanga, looks now at how countries have been learning from past outbreaks to be better prepared.
Before COVID-19, there was another epidemic. Guinea and its neighbours, Sierra Leone and Liberia, battled the Ebola virus. The outbreak in 2014 lasted 2 years and was much worse than coronavirus has been in the region so far. Back then, 28,000 people fell ill and 11,000 died.
En Guinée, suite à la détection de 3 cas confirmés de la maladie à virus Ebola.
So this announcement of a new Ebola outbreak on state television in Guinea is bound to scare many.
De la maladie à virus Ebola en Guinée.
The first case is believed to be a nurse who died at the end of January. Some of those who attended her funeral in Nzerokore in the southeast of Guinea also contracted the disease. General Remy Lamar is Guinea's health minister.
Immediately actions were taken. In Gueke, there is already an isolation and treatment center. And in Nzerekore, there is also a center that has been set up since the first Ebola epidemic.
Guinea was the origin point of the 2014 outbreak, and there are fears the virus could quickly spread through the region. But a lot has changed since then. Doctors, nurses, and scientists now know how to fight the disease, and new facilities have been set up. Perhaps the biggest developments have been in the science. There are now 2 approved Ebola vaccines, as well as treatments that increase a patient's chances of survival. The Democratic Republic of Congo has suffered the most Ebola outbreaks. Its 12th was also announced this month in the east of the country. Despite huge logistical challenges, it's used all means available, boats, planes, cars, to get vaccines to remote areas. But getting communities on board is vital. In the DRC in 2019, Ebola health workers and facilities were attacked because of mistrust from local populations.
One of the biggest lessons is that we have to involve more and more the community and the population.
Nicholas Mully is head of emergencies at the Alliance for International Medical Action.
Instead of doing for them, we have to give them the means and resources to be fully part of the response. So it means, for example, that we have to decentralize as much as we can the healthcare to the patient. And instead of having a big treatment center, it is better to provide the treatment in health facilities where the local health worker would be able to use it.
Hope is certainly here for those at risk of being infected with Ebola. But this is still a deadly disease that needs to be tackled quickly and effectively.
Catherine Birahanga with that report, and when you look at the stats between 2013 and 2016, more than 11,000 people died in that West Africa Ebola epidemic. Quite something that we now have a vaccine that they will be rolling out.
And talking of statistics, one thing to look at, I really recommend online an article on Africa's data gap, measuring the cost of not counting the dead, how mortality statistics are not sufficiently detailed to help get a real grasp on the picture of what's happening around the continent. It's a very, very good, very comprehensive look at that. And we want to talk more about the lessons of the past outbreaks that Catherine was talking about in her report just now, and looking ahead in preparing for the vaccine rollout, with so much depending on it. What are the challenges, particularly? The continent as a whole has recorded more than 100,000 deaths from coronavirus, but as we were hearing, a lot of primary care networks are actually set up and quite effective. We're going to talk about this now. On the line from Abuja is writer and commentator Uwabale Edward Ekpu. As we move into the sort of the vaccine stage of this story, what do you think are going to be the main constraints? Is it going to be the delivery or the supply of vaccine?
The main constraint will be not really on the delivery, but from acquisition, getting vaccines to come to Africa from Europe, the Americas, or from India. So in terms of delivery and supply, there are actually challenges due to the fact that what we are seeing now is unprecedented. So likewise, as you can see globally, where the value chain and the logistic infrastructure has to be expanded, such also is required in Africa. So, but the problem with what we have in Africa is that we have limited resources right from time. But in Africa, there is strong experience in handling, distributing vaccines, even down to the most remote areas in the country. Yeah.
So the experience is there, and therefore the structures are. The problem is, once again, with the raw material, with the resource. So if you think, for example, of the problems in getting PPE, there was a problem in sourcing the PPE and getting it to the people that needed it. You think the same thing is going to happen with the vaccines?
Exactly. The problem we're having with the vaccines right now is that at the moment, most African countries have done what they can do with the resources they have. They are ready. They have increased storage, and some have even bought deep freezers that can store ultra cold vaccines. But they don't have these vaccines yet. Since last year, we had vaccine rolling out in Europe and in America, but we still don't have it in Africa.
Now, I'm interested in what you say there about the cold chains, the so-called cold chain, the kind of the need to keep some of the vaccines ultra cold. Therefore, you need ultra freezers as well, which in rich countries are often only available in hospitals anyway. They're quite sophisticated material. Are you saying that actually there is a cold chain being got ready, as far as you're aware, across the continent?
Yeah, in terms of extra cold storage is very limited. The fact that it's very limited, but there have been history of the use of vaccines that need such temperature. For instance, during the Ebola, the vaccine that has been used in Africa against Ebola needs minus 70 degree storage, and they used it in Rwanda. It was used in Congo to vaccinate up to 340,000 people. It was used in Rwanda, it was used in Burundi, and it was used in South Sudan. So if you look at it, that experience is there. Then even at this moment, many countries have actually bought deep freezers. Recently, the Pfizer vaccine was distributed to 4 countries in Africa. Actually, 13 countries applied for the vaccines. That means they have the capacity to store it.
So they're confident that they have that cold chain. Listen, many thanks indeed for that overview of the situation regards the delivery of vaccine. That was Uwabale Edward Ekpu, based in Abuja.
Newsday BBC World Service. Claire MacDonald, Lawrence Pollard with you. Thank you for joining us. 1 year after the formation of South Sudan's National Unity Government, what's changed? Well, President Salva Kiir and his former rival Riek Machar formed a National Unity Government, ending 6 years of bloody civil war in the youngest country in Africa. Their supporters and the international community hoped the leaders would find a way to force agreement. So let's have a look at what challenges remain and go live to Juba, the capital of South Sudan, and talk to Stephen Parkour, a member of Mr. Machar's party and the Minister for Peacebuilding Implementation. Welcome to Newsday. A year on, many people would say, well, it would seem things have stalled. What has really progressed in moving things forward for the people of South Sudan since this unity government was formed? Why have we seen things stall to the extent that they have?
Well, there are so many factors. The implementation of the peace agreements has two tracks. One is the transitional security arrangement, which is being now supervised and implemented through the NTC, the National Transitional Committee. Then you have the Chapter 1, which is the responsibility sharing. One major factor for all the delays was actually the COVID-19. When the RTGUN was formed, it was formed actually amid the spike of the COVID-19 cases. So we have not been working for over 3 months. That's one thing. And then the negotiation dragged on. Now we have finished that process. What is going on now is the formation of the state government. We have just formed the state government of Central Equatoria. The legislature will be put in place soon. And I think we are making progress along that direction.
It does seem incredible to many people. It was a long, excuse me for interrupting, a long and bloody road to this point. But many listening to this will say, well, because of the COVID situation and the fact that you have millions, almost 60% of the country food insecure, is even more of an impetus, surely, to get government working to help the people. Many would say you have been too slow on this, given the fact you are facing a catastrophic pandemic in your country.
Oh yes, we really delayed. There were logistical issues, negotiations among the parties has also dragged on. The agreement has been renegotiated a lot here in Juba. Yes, political wranglings among the parties, the power sharing or responsibility sharing process was a difficult, painful thing that we have gone through. But every problem we are facing in the country is actually compounded by the COVID-19 itself. Because with the COVID-19 rules, you are not supposed to meet, in a room with 100 people or more. Even now, our Council of Ministers is not functioning. We cannot hold any public meeting in the country now. That has halted so many things. Even the meeting among the parties now is limited sometimes only to 10 people.
So now that you are forming the state government, as you said, so things are slowly moving forward after this hiatus to kind of understand how you can meet safely under the current conditions. So can you give people listening to this any kind of time frame as to when they will see all of those people in place so that you can get on with running government, with running the country effectively, and not slip back into the civil unrest that we've seen? Because when people are left in desperate situations without effective leadership, it's a fragile piece that could so easily unravel, couldn't it?
Yes, I cannot give you the exact date when we will complete the processes of forming the 10 states governments and the legislative assemblies, the county government, and so on. It could take a longer time depending on the circumstances of the overall situation of crisis we are in. The country is facing multiple crises, as you have seen: economic crisis, COVID-19, and I agree with you. The vacuum in the state, the political vacuum in the state is also a crisis by itself. But the leadership of the country is trying its best to make sure that those governments are in place.
How do you feel? I wanted to ask you about President Biden gave an address to the African Union summit earlier this month, expressing a very positive message about how the United States now stands ready to be the African Union's partner in solidarity, support and mutual respect. He went on to say a future committed to investing in our democratic institutions, promoting human rights of all people. Must be very music to the ears of people in your situation. But I guess what he's saying is the key part of that sentence is democratic institutions wanting to see you succeed. How heartened are you by that message from President Biden?
Well, that's very important. In fact, the agreement has addressed fundamental problems of South Sudan. So if this agreement is implemented, we will have democratic institutions. Political space should be open. It is an agreement that gives the people of South Sudan an opportunity to write their own constitution, permanent constitution, prepare them for the elections at the end of the transitional period. The agreement is an agreement of reforms, political reforms, institutional reforms, constitutional reforms, you name it. It is an agreement of reform. So it will also put the country back to the world maps as a country pursuing peace, because in the global map we have been known only for wars. Now guns have gone silent in the country, which is also a progress that should be maintained. All we need from the international community, Biden administration, European Union, Troika, and the entire international community is a support, supporting this process, because this is something that also needs the support of the international community.
Thank you so much for joining us on Newsday on the BBC World Service. That's Stephen Parkour, member of Riek Machar's party and Minister for Peacebuilding Implementation in South Sudan.
10 minutes to the hour. James Gregg's here with the sport.
Loads to get through, but we'll start with the Premier League. Jose Mourinho says Tottenham have problems that he can't resolve, but he insists that they're not in a crisis. Well, they lost 2-1 yesterday to West Ham. It was their 5th defeat in 6 Premier League matches, and they're now in 9th place.
If crisis is frustration and sadness in the dressing room, I would say so, because nobody is happy. When a team fights the way the team did until the last second, trying to get a different result, is never a group crisis.
West Ham, meanwhile, they've won 7 out of their last 9 in the league. They're up to 4th place in the table. Leicester City won 2-1 at Aston Villa to stay in 3rd. Manchester United with 3-1 winners over Newcastle, and they're in 2nd. But they're all still 10 points behind Manchester City. They won 1-0 against Arsenal yesterday, courtesy of Raheem Sterling's early goal. Pep Guardiola's side have now won 18 matches in a row.
I'm surprised and impressed. We were consistent for the last 2 months. I didn't expect it. We cannot forget, we won in Anfield, we won against Tottenham in Goodison Park, here away, 3 incredible tough games away. That's why I'm more than pleased to win just 1-0.
Tanzania have offered to host the match that was postponed last week between Belouizdad and Mamelodi Sundowns. That's due to South Africa's COVID-19 concerns. Problem is, the South African FA last week said that they weren't going to have any teams playing on neutral ground because of the farce over the Wydad Casablanca versus Kaizer Chiefs. So we'll have to see how that one pans out. Final round of group games today in the African Cup of Nations under-20 tournament as well. Ghana versus Gambia, Morocco versus Tanzania. All teams who are playing today can go through. Elsewhere, Inter Milan, they won the Milan derby. Novak Djokovic says hungry young players are on their way to winning Grand Slams. That's despite 15 years of dominance by him, Roger Federer and Rafa Nadal. He beat Daniel Medvedev to win the Australian Open title yesterday. It's his 18th major title. Federer and Nadal have 20 each.
There's a lot of quality from the younger guys that are coming up, but Roger, Rafa, myself are still there for a reason. We don't want to hand it to them, and we don't want to allow them to win slams. I mean, I think that's something that is very clear.
And talking of legends and majors, Tiger Woods caused a bit of a stir last night. He said that he's sure that he'll be ready to play at the Masters in April. He had a 5th back surgery just before Christmas, but he says that he doesn't have much wriggle room. More sport online as ever, bbc.com/sport, and also on the Africa pages too. Back next hour here on Newsday.
Thank you, James Gregg, with the sport. Now let's talk about the situation in Armenia, and in particular calls by the opposition for rolling acts of civil disobedience to force the Prime Minister to resign. The opposition blames the Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, for Armenia's humiliating defeat in the recent war with Azerbaijan over the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. It cost thousands of lives. It resulted in Azerbaijan taking its former territories back. Let's speak now to the BBC's Rehan Dimitri. What exactly are the opposition planning then?
Well, they're suggesting to block traffic, paralyze cities, also kind of prevent public transport from moving. They are calling for people to participate in kind of general strike, and now they're saying let's do it kind of in a non-stop motion starting from today. Ironically, these are the same tactics that were used by the supporters of Nikol Pashinyan, the current Prime Minister, 3 years ago when he led a so-called non-violent Velvet Revolution, and that's how he came to power. The opposition wants Pashinyan to resign, and they've been demanding it for a long time now, because they are saying they're blaming him for signing as what they describe as a treacherous kind of truce agreement with neighboring Azerbaijan. That truce agreement was brokered by Russia back in November 2020, and as a result of that agreement, Armenia, of course, lost territories that it formerly controlled. There are massive, just huge, enormous human costs, and there's also an unresolved issue with the prisoners of war.
I mean, it was effective last time, partly because Pashinyan was such a sort of a figurehead for the demonstrations. Do the opposition have anyone similar this time to focus protests around?
No, they don't. And Pashinyan still maintains that he is the most popular politician in the country. The opposition, there's a movement which comprised of 15 parties. It's called the Home Salvation Movement. And most of these parties are little known to people, but there are some bigger parties, such as the former governing Republican Party. But all of those faces are kind of, they've been in power. They're not that charismatic. They don't really have much support. And that's why these protests, they've been going on since last November. They failed really to attract large crowds. This past weekend on Saturday, there were maybe up to 10,000 people that were protesting. But still, these are not the numbers that Pashinyan galvanized 3 years ago.
With so many people affected by the events in Nagorno-Karabakh, both sort of families of servicemen affected by death, but also, of course, there's a large amount of Armenians displaced and coming back to Armenia as well. Is that enough to sort of affect the political balance in terms of the breadth of support for the government and for Pashinyan?
Well, the most kind of stinging issue for Nikol Pashinyan is the fate of the dozens of prisoners of war, because the exchange of prisoners of war was one of the key points in this truce agreement, which I just mentioned about. But there are still dozens of Armenian servicemen that are being held by Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is refusing to return them to Armenia because Azerbaijan is saying they were captured after the end of hostilities in November, and therefore they don't qualify to be recognized as prisoners of war. Azerbaijan calls them terrorists. But that is a very, very difficult issue for Pashinyan, because he did promise that issue will be resolved.
Right. So it doesn't sound like the civil disobedience is enough to bring around another change of government. But what will Pashinyan do? Does he nod to the opposition, or does he just plough on and ignore them?
Well, he's been ignoring them for the past 3 months, and he maintains that he still has popular support. He kind of agreed to hold snap election at the end of December, but then his government backed away. They said there is no need. Armenia needs to now focus on rebuilding Artsakh, that's what they call the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave, and rebuilding the country's economy.
Many thanks indeed. Reyhan Dimitri, the BBC's correspondent in the area. Many thanks indeed. With the background to the opposition calling for protests to unseat Nikol Pashinyan in Armenia.
This is the BBC World Service, with one man's search for his identity.
Tony May was only a few days old when he was abandoned by the River Thames in London in 1942.
Who on earth abandoned me? What did you do that for?
He was desperate for answers, and that really struck me. I'm Claire Bates, and I'll be telling Tony's extraordinary story.
Embankment Baby, Sunday at 14 GMT. And in an hour, Hard Talk with Stephen Sacker.
My guest is Timothy Snyder, renowned American historian of totalitarianism and the Holocaust, who's made waves far beyond academia with the links he has made between Donald Trump, tyranny, and fascism. Historical parallels are seductive, but are they useful?
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to Newsday on the BBC World
Guest who knows all about scoring in the Liverpool squad against the Liverpool squad. There was that Liverpool-Everton Merseyside derby. We're going to be reflecting on the weekend's football and the first win at Anfield for Everton in over 20 years. All on the way. Stay with us here on Newsday.
We start trying to get a glimpse of the situation in Ethiopia, particularly in the region of Tigray. The International Committee of the Red Cross says the needs of the people there who've been affected by the fighting are overwhelming and greater than previously thought. Tigray, of course, is the site of a military offensive by the federal government, which has been going on since November against the ruling party, the TPLF, in Tigray. Speaking to the BBC on a visit to Ethiopia, Dominic Stillhart, who is the Director of Operations for the Red Cross, said the humanitarian response needs to be urgently scaled up. Before he went back to Geneva, the BBC's Leila Natou caught up with him and started by asking what he'd been hearing from colleagues on the ground.
The humanitarian situation is really very bad. There are overwhelming needs. Our teams are reporting that they are constantly taken aback by the needs they are discovering on the ground. The food security situation becomes extremely tense. The people in Tigray, they essentially lost the harvest season because of the fighting that's been going on. There are serious issues with regards to access to medical care. These are some of the issues, and I think we are still not able to have a comprehensive picture. We are still putting the entire picture together, but from what I understand from our teams on the ground, the needs are overwhelming and definitely larger than we would have expected.
And you're not being stopped or prohibited from visiting areas that you would otherwise like to go to?
Yeah, the situation is challenging because in several areas fighting is still ongoing. You have a variety of fighting forces on the ground. And there is also, very honestly speaking, a capacity issue. We need to still scale up our own capacity to be able to respond in these main urban centres and then also to go beyond these urban centres.
As the ICRC, you would like more access to be able to scale up your operations to play a greater role?
There is very clearly a need for a very significant scaling up of the humanitarian response, not just by ourselves, but by the international community, by the humanitarian community. And these are some of the discussions that are now ongoing. There have been positive developments last week in terms of more staff coming in, especially also from UN organizations, but more is required. It is really important that we get all the collaboration and cooperation from the government that is now needed to scale up and be able to respond to what the needs are on the ground.
That's the head, the Director of Operations for the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, speaking about the situation in Tigray to our Leila Natou.
Newsday, BBC World Service. Let's take you to South Africa now, because a spokesperson for the opposition Rwanda National Congress, or RNC, in South Africa has confirmed to the BBC that the Rwandan exile Sif Bamporiki was killed in Cape Town on Sunday afternoon. Mr. Bamporiki was the national coordinator for the RNC. So what was behind this killing? Let's talk this through with BBC's Nomsa Maseko in Johannesburg. Nomsa, tell us the circumstances surrounding his death. What do we know?
Well, according to Rwanda's National Congress, we understand that Mr. Bamporiki, who runs a shop that sells beds in Cape Town, received a call from a potential client asking him if he had any beds to sell. And that person then went to the shop, and that is where he met up with Mr. Bamporiki. He paid for the bed and then said he would like for it to be delivered to his house, which is situated in Nyanga Township, which is one of the most dangerous townships in the country. We understand that Mr. Bamporiki was unsettled about this and then asked that a colleague or friend accompany him there. And then from what we gather, the person who they were going with to deliver the bed asked for the car to be stopped at a dead-end road, saying that his house was nearby and he was going to open his house and then call them to come and deliver the bed. They then waited for about 15 minutes and there was nothing. While they were still there, two assailants came out of nowhere, shot Mr. Bamboriki through the window of the vehicle where he was seated, fatally wounding him, and that was the end of his life.
And at this stage, is there anything further to point to this being politically motivated? You mentioned, though, that this township is extremely dangerous. So what are people saying?
Exactly. It's very difficult to tell at this stage if there was any, involvement or alleged involvement, as people are speculating all over social media, that this could have been a hit ordered by Rwanda's president, Paul Kagame. But others are saying, but we do know that Nyanga Township at some stage had the highest murder rate in South Africa, and killings like this one are not, extraordinary. These things happen all the time. But we also understand from the police that they are still investigating. No one has been arrested yet. We also understand that after the shooting, the assailants took the mobile phones and wallets. So people are saying that, well, this has been made to look like a robbery if it was indeed a hit that was ordered from Rwanda.
Yeah, and we do know that several opponents of the Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, have been killed abroad, including in South Africa. So I guess it's understandable that people might be joining those kind of dots.
A lot of people are joining those kind of dots because if you would recall, in 2010, General Nyamwasa, who was the army general of the Rwandan army, there was an assassination attempt on his life. In fact, there were two assassination attempts on his life, followed in which people were arrested and convicted for that attempted murder. But a few years later, in 2014, the former spy chief of Rwanda, Mr. Patrick Karegeya, was also strangled, murdered at a hotel in Johannesburg. And at that time, we do recall that Paul Kagame had said that terrorists should not be spared, and that that statement was then viewed as an attack on whoever was seen to be opposing him. And we do also remember that back in 2014, the South African government was livid. Shortly after Mr. Karegeya was murdered, went as far as expelling the High Commissioner of Rwanda here in South Africa, because they were saying that Paul Kagame was ordering hits to be taking place here in South Africa, and Paul Kagame himself, in return, accused South Africa of harboring dissidents.
Nomsa, thank you for the update. The BBC's Nomsa Musteko is talking to us from Johannesburg.
We're going to talk about the vaccine in Israel, that huge rollout of the vaccine there and what's being learned there, and also a little bit of art history. But first we go to one of our top stories this morning, which is Myanmar. The situation there appears to be a well-observed general strike. This has been called by the protest movement, spreading out across the country in response to the military coup earlier this month. Now, 2 people were killed during protests over the weekend. The military has issued another stern warning on television against people taking to the streets and risking themselves. Now, diplomatically, America has warned of firm action against the military without specifying what that might be. But what's it like on the street? Thompson Chow is editor with Frontier, previously the Myanmar Times. He's in Yangon, where it's the middle of the day and where many have taken to the street.
Well, indeed, there are mass protests happening right now, and resistance efforts have dominated the whole country and the city since the protests began following the coup. But today does feel like it is a lot bigger than before, with a lot of more roads blocked, highways blocked, and shops closed everywhere we go.
What sort of presence is there from the police, and particularly the army?
There has been reportedly a police presence and army presence. I was in a smaller protest outside the UN, one of the UN offices, earlier today, and now I'm near one of the major protests, and you see some of the people started wearing helmets. I think that's in part mainly in response to the shootings over the weekend, where security forces shot and killed several of the protesters.
I've been looking at some of the pictures, and one thing that strikes you is how colour coordinated some of the protests are, that they're there in yellow hard hats, white hard hats, red uniforms, and that kind of thing. How organised is the demonstrating? Are there speeches? Do people make speeches in public? Do the people move, or do they just sort of sit and try to block traffic and that kind of thing?
I think the tactics have been creatively evolving all along. A few days ago there has been breaking down the cars in an attempt to bring the city to a halt. Today is more of a huge strike, whereas in the sense that everyone's not going to work, all the shops are closed, companies I've spoken to are not working. I still see red everywhere. Red is the colour associated with the National League of Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's party. So most people have their red flags and red banners and red T-shirts, many of them, to show off support.
And from your point of view, if the strike is effective, does that mean that, for example, the government can't function? I mean, you said that shops are shut, but what about offices? What about government functions, hospitals, things like that?
Yeah, both really, all of them. Part of the resistance effort is the civil disobedience movement, kick-started with government doctors. And I think many companies and analysts I've spoken to are now thinking, there's a good chance that the military would find it ungovernable. We're talking about officials at state companies, reportedly in tax departments, government doctors, engineers, all going on strike. And combined with employees of private banks, the local banks have been closed for days. And I think one of the things to watch is later this week, when it approaches payday, how can employers pay their employees? I think that's a big question.
Well, that's a pretty vivid picture of what it's actually like in Yangon, and we get the impression that similar moves in the street are happening elsewhere as well. A large general strike trying to disable the coup and the government of the generals. That was Thompson Chow of Frontier.
Newsday, BBC World Service. Let's get you updated on all the sports news now. Here's James Craig.
Well, the standout moment from the Premier League weekend was undoubtedly at Anfield, where Everton produced a really sublime Merseyside derby performance to beat Liverpool at Anfield for the first time since 1999. It was a landmark result for both sides. Everton earned their first derby win anywhere since 2010. Liverpool have now lost 4 successive home matches for the first time since 1923, unbelievably. So 22 years since the last win at Anfield, and the man who gifted them victory that day with a winner at Anfield joins me live now here on Newsday. It's Kevin Campbell. Thanks so much for joining us on Newsday, Kevin. What did you think when you scored that goal at Anfield 22 years ago when you celebrated that day? You can't have thought it was going to be 22 years till there was another victory for the Blues.
Good morning. No, I didn't think that at all. I thought, this hopefully is the turning point, for Everton at the time. Getting a win at Anfield is always very difficult, but I didn't realise it would be this difficult for the club. But obviously, I'm so delighted that these players have got the club over the line and got the victory, and it feels very good.
What are your memories of that goal? I mean, you must have turned around and seen absolute pandemonium in the away end.
Well, not only the away end, I think in the Kop, when the ball hit the back of the net when I scored, there were Blues in the Kop, which was fantastic, and little pockets all over the ground. That's the unique thing about the Merseyside derby, Blues sit with Reds all over the ground, and it's an amazing experience. But obviously, I know the Blues and the Annie Road were going crazy.
What about that performance then on Saturday? It'll be so memorable for those Everton fans. Unfortunately, they couldn't be there for obvious reasons, but I mean, what a great performance to talk about for however many years.
Oh, it was a Carlo Ancelotti masterclass. I think for me, Everton set their stall out perfectly. They weren't going to concede. They defended very well, and in James Rodriguez and Richarlison, they created a threat. Now, Richarlison scored early from a great pass by Rodriguez, and getting your noses in front is very important in this game, and at least you got something to hold on to. There were scary times as well, of course, but they all played absolutely fantastic, and the substitutions were great. And to win the game 2-0, like they did, I think is real testament to the professionalism of the boys.
Yeah, look, you mentioned Carlo Ancelotti, the Everton boss. He was talking post-match on Saturday about their hopes for the rest of the season.
Champions League is too much. We have to wait a little bit. We are really worried because the next game is at home.
Well, obviously you're sort of joking a bit there, Kevin, isn't he, about the home form? Look, is top four realistic for Carlo Ancelotti and Everton? He's playing his side's chances down there, but, you know, make a case for them finishing top four, Kevin.
Well, if they could perform like they did consistently on Saturday, then they have a chance. But I think Carlo Ancelotti makes a good point. You know, the home form has been patchy at times and has really been the Achilles heel for this Everton side. And that's the frustrating thing as fans, where you see, you know, Everton could beat a lot of the big sides, and, you know, they come unstuck against maybe the lesser teams like a Fulham or a Newcastle at home. So, you know, sometimes you don't know what type of Everton you're going to get, but with a bit of luck, this gives them a great opportunity to build on.
Look, Arsenal, another one of your former sides, also in action yesterday, Kevin. Tough ask, of course, against Manchester City with their form that they're in at the moment. There's lots of Arsenal fans who listen to this programme all around the world. What can be the best outcome for them this season?
Listen, I just think the league is always going to be difficult when you lose so many games. They've been so inconsistent again in the league. So I think everything has to go into the Europa League. Obviously, Arsenal want to win games in the league and push up. It, you know, was maybe a too tough a ask against a Man City team who are just on an unbelievable tear at the moment. But, you know, the team has been inconsistent. There's been a lot of surgery going on in the team behind the scenes as well. So I just think Arsenal have to put all their eggs in the basket and look for the Europa League and finish as high up as they can in the league, because Arsenal have been standing still over the years, and they have to try and start to rebuild properly in the summer.
Yeah. Hey, Kevin Campbell, thanks so much for joining us here on Newsday. The former Everton and Arsenal star. He was, of course, the last man to score a derby winner for Everton at Anfield back in 1999 until Saturday. More sports online as ever at bbc.com/sport.
I don't know how happy he'd be at that news, James, because he must be happy that they've won finally back at Anfield. But there goes his record. Thank you, as ever, James Gregg with the sports news. Now, there were very excited scenes in gyms, swimming pools and shopping centres in Israel on Sunday as the country began easing its COVID-19 restrictions. The decision to ease lockdown restrictions followed data showing infections are continuing to decline following the country's rapid vaccination effort. Let's speak now to Joel Greenberg, BBC Monitoring's member out there in Jerusalem. Joel, good to have you on the programme. So talk us through what can open and what you have to have or show to be able to get into these areas that are now reopening.
Yes, hi. What's reopening really is things like pools and gyms. Music and theater performances are being resumed, and sporting events, but for people with these green badges. In other words, people that have either a green badge or what's called a green pass, which shows that they've received the 2 doses of the vaccination, they will be allowed into these facilities, of course, with limited attendance. But the fact that these are reopening has caused for a lot of celebration, a lot of coverage in the media this morning.
And how is that affecting schools as well? Have they started reopening?
Yes, there's been a reopening. They've expanded it actually to more high school grades in cities where infection rates are low. So people in the Israeli system in high school grades 10 through 12 are able to go back to school as well. Also, malls, markets, street shops, and museums are open to the general population, again, with certain limitations, of course, regarding distance and the number of people. but there's a general move by the government to ease the restrictions of this third lockdown all across the country.
And of course, the world will be watching because as vaccinations roll out in other countries to see how Israel copes with opening up and how their monitoring system works so that infections don't go up again. I mean, to have a sort of doses per head count of population, 74 people in every 100 in Israel have now been vaccinated. It's, as far as Israelis are concerned, it's been a huge success story, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. I mean, in terms of international statistics, it's the highest rate globally. And right now they stand at more than 45% of the population having received at least a first dose of the vaccine. So, yes, and tracking has already shown declines in daily reported new cases, percentage of positive test results, and number of seriously ill patients, for example. So the first signs of the effect of the vaccine. There have also been other studies done showing that the vaccine is actually very effective in preventing illness, serious illness, and death. So, yes, the statistics as they mount here will be watched very closely.
And of course, we know that it's to have an effective inoculation program going forward. Everybody needs an inoculation. There's been a lot of focus on what's been happening to the Palestinian population as well, and the difficulties that many parts of that population have had getting hold of the vaccine. What's the update on that?
Yes, the Palestinians have definitely lagged significantly behind Israel in this. Human rights organizations have said that Israel really has an obligation because it controls much of the Palestinian territory to provide vaccines. Israel has allowed some vaccines in, mainly for medical teams, but it has said that it wants to first inoculate its own population before handing over vaccines to the Palestinians. However, it has allowed shipments of the Russian vaccine to come in, and they have been distributed in the Palestinian areas. Still, only about 10,000 have arrived from Russia, so there's much more needed. And this continues to be an issue as Israel comes under pressure to increase the number of vaccines that it allocates to the Palestinians.
And I know the Israeli Builders Association has said, yes, we need to roll that out because, of course, Palestinians crossing over into Israel on a daily basis to help on construction sites and the like. Thank you for the update, Joel. Joel Greenberg there talking to us from BBC Monitoring in Jerusalem.
Now to an image well known all over the world, the face wide open in a scream set against a swirling background, and there are actually 4 versions of it. I'm talking about The Scream by Edvard Munch. Not only 1 million T-shirts have it, it's also been stolen, and it's a phenomenon as much as an amazing image. And there was something extra in one of the 4 versions of The Scream, a scribble in pencil underneath the paint, which says, "Can only have been painted by a madman." So who wrote that? A critic? An enemy? A vandal? Well, someone who thinks she knows is my Britt Gulleng, who is a curator at the National Museum of Norway, who's been investigating this mysterious inscription. First off, what were the theories? Before we give us your answer, what did people think, who did people think could have been behind this?
Well, there are several theories. One of them is the tactless visitor. And the other one is that it might have been Munch himself, but nobody really asked the question, why should he write such a thing on his own painting? So that's what we've been asking ourselves. And we also wanted to find out if this really was Munch or who did it, because this is, as you said, one of the most famous paintings in the world, and this is the first version that we have at the National Museum.
So it could have been a critic, it could have been a vandal, it could have been the artist himself. What have you decided?
We have decided that this is Munch himself, and we think we know why.
That was going to be my next question. Why would you do that? Is it a weird kind of autograph in some way?
I think it's an ironic comment, and it's also a comment that shows his vulnerability. So, and the background was probably exhibition he held in Oslo in 1895, where he received a lot of criticism for his mad art, his abnormal brain, how hallucinated he was, because this is a very provoking painting. It's highly original, and he was accused of being mad.
Now, would he have been upset about that, or would he have worn that as a badge of pride, as a badge of courage?
Yeah, he would if it had been in the romantic sense of the word, where the notion was that there is a connection between being mad and between madness and creativity. But this accusation came from a medical student. And that makes a huge difference, I think.
Oh, that might because I understand there was kind of like mental illness in his family as well, so that might have rather sort of disturbed him.
It disturbed him because his sister, Laura, his younger sister, had been hospitalized 3 years earlier with a serious mental illness. And there was also other members of his family who had melancholia, and he was very worried about hereditary diseases in his family. So this hit a sore point.
And there he is, putting this sort of front and absolutely centre. When you are displaying it, what I wanted to know was, is this visible? If I come and see the painting on the wall of your museum, is it actually visible? Is it something that you're going to draw attention to now?
Well, if you get very close, if you go really, really close...
Am I allowed really, really close or not?
Yeah, quite close, but maybe not close enough because the letters are quite small, and this also adds to
the mystery that you've managed to solve. Thank you so much, curator at the National Museum of Norway, May-Britt Gulleng, on Edvard Munch and his painting, which could only have been painted by a madman, said the man himself.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and here's what's happening in the studio this week.
Though he gained worldwide recognition for his award-winning novel The Famished Road, the Booker Prize-winning Nigerian author Ben Okri has received critical acclaim for his poems. I'm Bola Mosuro, and in this programme we hear how a poem forms like a plant waiting to sprout.
In the studio, Tuesday at 13:30 and 23:30 GMT. And in 30 minutes, Business Daily with Justin Rolat.
Zero carbon electricity is easy. We've got solar, wind and nuclear. No, the real climate change challenge will be finding emission-free ways to make steel, cement and fertiliser and to power ships and trucks. So could hydrogen be the explosive answer?
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up after the news on the BBC World Service, it's Hard Talk with me, Stephen Sacker. Donald Trump is holed up in Florida, not the White House, and his presidency is history. So, not surprisingly, historians are trying to find some perspective on a president who stress-tested American democracy like no other. My guest is Timothy Snyder, one of America's leading historians of totalitarianism and the Holocaust. He believes Trump and his movement brought America face to face with early-stage fascism. Is that pushing historical parallels too far?
You always think that these problems happen in other countries. There couldn't possibly be a far-right movement in my country. There couldn't possibly be domestic terrorism in my country. That's what history is there for. History is there to tell you that your country is not exceptional in these ways.
That's Timothy Snyder on Hard Talk after the news.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. In the largest protest since Myanmar's military seized power 3 weeks ago, hundreds of thousands of people have filled the streets in citizen towns across the country. The military has warned protesters they're risking their lives. Jonathan Head is monitoring events from neighbouring Thailand.
We're seeing images coming from multiple towns and cities all over the country that show very large numbers of people filling out the streets. You're talking about possibly hundreds of thousands in the big cities. In some towns, a complete and total shutdown of all commercial life, so no shops, no markets, nothing functioning at all. This is an impressive show, this general strike. I think it's an attempt to demonstrate to the military that they just don't have any public support. And as a visual show of defiance, it doesn't get a whole lot bigger. Now, how the security forces handle this, the numbers are so big today, it will be pretty difficult for them. As always, we always have to look out for what happens in smaller towns where we have found in the last 2 to 3 weeks the security forces willing to be a lot more aggressive.
The Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has welcomed an announcement by NATO that has made no final decision on the withdrawal of its troops from Afghanistan. Mr. Ghani told the BBC this would provide an opportunity to accelerate the peace process with the Taliban.
We have a sense of urgency. We have put a lot of things on the table. We've done a lot, and we've sacrificed a tremendous amount. It is time that Taliban and their supporters show the same will for seeking peace as they've demonstrated in seeking conflict.
The US playmaker Boeing has recommended suspending flights of its 777 aircraft powered by Pratt & Whitney 4000 engines until an inspection protocol is in place. An engine of this type caught fire and came off a United Airlines flight near Denver, Colorado on Saturday. Andrew Wood reports.
United Airlines Flight 328 to Hawaii had to return to Denver after its right-hand engine failed and then partly disintegrated. The debris fell on a residential area, but no one was hurt. Boeing says there are 69 777 jets that use the same type of engine as the United flight, the Pratt & Whitney 4000. United didn't wait for Boeing's recommendation to ground the planes pending investigations, and all its 24 aircraft of the same type have been withdrawn from service. In addition, Japan says no 777s with that engine can enter its airspace.
The top Chinese official overseeing Hong Kong says its electoral system must be reformed so that only those considered patriots can hold key positions. Xia Baolong said posts in the executive, the legislature and the judiciary must not be taken by anyone who oppose China. World News from the BBC. The Chinese Foreign Minister has called on the Biden administration to reopen dialogue to restore relations damaged under Donald Trump. Wang Yi urged Washington to remove unfair tariffs on Chinese goods and abandon what he called an unreasonable suppression of the tech sector. President Biden will attend a candle-lighting ceremony at sundown today once officials confirmed that the number of people who've died with COVID-19 in the United States has passed 500,000. Mr. Biden will also take part in a moment of silence. Health officials have reported decreases in new coronavirus cases and hospitalizations, but they've warned it's essential to keep safety measures to prevent another catastrophic surge. The opposition in Armenia has called for rolling acts of civil disobedience from today to force the country's Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, to resign over his defeat in the recent Nagorno-Karabakh war. Our Caucasus correspondent is Rayhan Dimitri.
They're suggesting to block traffic, paralyze cities. They are calling for people to participate in kind of general strike. The opposition wants Pashinyan to resign, and they've been demanding it for a long time now because they're blaming him for signing as what they describe as a treacherous kind of truce agreement with neighbouring Azerbaijan.
The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson will announce today that all schools in England will reopen on the 8th of March as part of his wider roadmap to ease coronavirus lockdown restrictions. Mr. Johnson, who was accused of acting too late and relaxing curbs too early last year, has said he'll lay out a cautious but irreversible plan to ensure no more lockdowns in England. Other measures expected today include allowing more socialising. BBC News.
Welcome to Hard Talk on the BBC World Service with me, Stephen Sacker. My guest today is an American historian whose canvas has broadened over decades of research and writing. Professor Timothy Snyder established his reputation as one of the great historians of totalitarianism and the Holocaust. His primary focus was on the geographical area of Eastern Europe, which in the first half of the 20th century experienced devastation at the hands of Hitler and Stalin. The Bloodlands was his name for the vast territory in which more than 13 million people lost their lives during war and occupation. His later book on the Holocaust, Black Earth, focused on the degree to which the extermination of the Jews, driven by Hitler's ideology, was also a reflection of broken states descended into chaos. Those were works of history, but of late he's used history to comment on contemporary phenomena, in particular the rise of modern-day tyranny. He cites Putin's Russia as an example, and the extraordinary rise of Donald Trump in the United States. He's been dubbed the prophet of totalitarianism, but is he in danger of pushing historical parallels too far in his determination to engage with the politics of today? Well, Timothy Snyder joins me now on the line from Vienna. Welcome to Hard Talk.
Glad to be with you.
You are a world-renowned historian, but increasingly you seem to be engaged with the politics of the present, and I'm wondering why that is. Is it for the simple reason that you do not believe the lessons of history are being learned?
I think a lot of it has to do with demand. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that whether you're in the US or in the UK or in Europe or other places, there have been a lot of surprising events, and historians are specialists in surprise. And most of the things that happened that we're supposed to remember from history, the First World War, the Second World War, and so on, were not expected or predicted at the time. So historians are there to say, look, nothing's predictable, don't be surprised, but hey, there are some patterns. And if we learn more about those patterns, we might be better able to come to grips with the problems that we're facing now.
Are you suggesting that if you understand the patterns and read them well enough, history can become some sort of forecasting tool?
Well, I mean, Isaiah Berlin, who taught at the place where I studied in your country, used to say that historians can't tell you what happened, but they're pretty good at telling you what didn't happen. I'd say that about the present and the future as well. Historians do have a sense of plausibility of what things might go together and what things won't go together. I mean, I'd also say that it's not about making specific forecasts. It is about having a sense of what has happened in the past and therefore what can happen. And the more you know about history, frankly, the broader your imagination is and the better you're going to be able to be at not being surprised. And I think that's the crucial thing.
So, Professor Schneider, let's get to the F word, in this case, fascism. You have used the word in connection with Donald Trump. How much thought did you give to the consequences of using that word?
Well, I mean, to be very clear, when we talk about fascism, we're not talking about something which is in a laboratory somewhere, in some kind of an experiment. We're talking about a current of thought and action, which was very much present in the United States and Europe. It didn't win everywhere. It won in some places, but it was present pretty much everywhere. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Germans were inspired by the Americans, not just the other way around. Fascism is an international trend, and it's still with us. Now, with Mr. Trump, what I said very specifically was post-truth, which is his way of carrying out politics, is pre-fascism. That is to say, if by way of technology and talent, you clear the field of the idea of factuality, you're opening the way for the big lie. And the big lie is the trap that people fall into and leads them to do things like, for example, violently storm a parliament, which just happened in the United States. And those things are, in fact, fascistic and can lead the way to fascism. So, of course, as you quite rightly say, one has to be careful about how one uses the word, but to ignore the phenomenon and the human possibility, I think, is just completely irresponsible.
And I take your point, and you've just repeated it, that you use this phrase pre-fascism in connection with Trump and his movement, but nonetheless, by using the word, you do invite comparisons and parallels to be drawn. And of course, the arch-fascist, the individual that we associate most closely with the word, is Hitler. So if one then says, is there anything about Donald Trump that can be compared to Adolf Hitler in terms of ideological drive, in terms of his use of political means? Are you saying there are any parallels at all to be drawn?
I mean, first of all, Stephen, I think we should drop the word parallels, because parallels are lines that don't meet. And history is not like that. History is one stream. I mean, there's only one history, and you're in it, and I'm in it, and Trump is in it, and Hitler is in it. It's not really so important what's exactly alike, what's not exactly alike. What's really important is being able to recognize patterns. So, of course, I'm not going to say that Trump is just like Hitler. That'd be idiotic. However, when you look at Hitler, You're looking at a package of things. And some of those things are worth noticing when you look at a contemporary politician. For example, mastery of new technology. For Hitler, those were mass speeches and the radio, right? For Trump, it's Twitter. The use of language is also similar. The call and response, the apparently spontaneous, actually rehearsed, quick hit lines. These things are rather similar. But what you do with this argument is you push it into a corner and you say, well, the guy's not exactly like Hitler. Basically what you're doing is you're saying, we have an excuse not to look at history because we're not finding the most extreme things. Frankly, I'm a lot more pessimistic about us. I think we ought to be very interrogative of ourselves and look for the ways in which we are similar to the 1920s and 30s and cut them off before we get to the past where things start to become really dangerous.
Right, and yet early in this conversation you said what's important often is what's not there as much as what is there. And what's not there surely is worth discussing in relation to Donald Trump. What we don't see in Donald Trump is ideological zealotry. I mean, you yourself said that in the end, Donald Trump is motivated most by what he sees in the mirror every morning, that is himself. What we also don't really seem to see in Donald Trump is a coherent organization. I don't think anybody would say Make America Great Again represented a disciplined political movement in the way that the Nazis developed one in late 20s and 1930s Germany. So aren't those differences profound and very important to note?
Right, but Stephen, notice that you only notice the differences when you make the comparison, right? I mean, you've just proven how making comparisons is fruitful. I wrote a whole book about what you just said. It's called The Road to Unfreedom, in which I argue that the difference between fascism and post-fascism, or not even fascism, which I sometimes call it, is that the fascists had one truth, as you say, and Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin and people of that ilk have zero truths. There's some similarity there. Both of them depend upon myth. Both of them want to drive out factuality. But there's also a difference. And I agree with you here. There's not a pronounced vision of the future in Trump as there is in Hitler. But notice, we're not able to have this fruitful conversation unless we make the comparison, unless we look at the past to see what's similar and what's different. If we dismiss this because we're afraid of taboos, then we become boring.
Yeah, well, I don't want us to be boring, and I hope we won't be. But maybe it's more fruitful to draw in other comparisons, which perhaps make America's moment today seem less dangerous, less sort of completely existential than you might contend that it is. For example, there are serious historians who've suggested that Donald Trump should be compared more to recent historical figures like Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines and Silvio Berlusconi in Italy than they should be to, the totalitarians of the past. And in a sense, they're focusing then on his vanity, his narcissism, his short-term, non-strategic approach to politics. Would you accept that there's some truth in that?
Absolutely. I mean, and those politicians have things in common with one another, and they have things in common with, let's say, Francisco Franco. You can make all kinds of comparisons. I mean, most of what I have done has been to compare Trump to contemporary failed dictators like Yanukovych in Ukraine, or contemporary successful dictators like Putin in Russia. But I do think we have to start from a different point. We have to start from the point that America really is facing an existential crisis. We really did have people, some of whom really are fascists, violently storm our Capitol. We really are in a situation where a sitting president tried to overturn a democratic election. Those things are crises, and we have to find the ways to explain those crises. I would take your point further, though, and say there are plenty of American comparisons to look at. But when you look hard at them, you realize that there's serious problems inside the American system, too. I'm totally open to that.
Yeah, but surely there are dangers in overplaying dangers as well as underplaying them. And what we learn from your own amazing research in Black Earth, your book about the rise of Hitler and Nazism and then the resulting Holocaust, what we learn is that not just was ideology vitally important to understand, but also it was vital to understand the nature of broken states and civil chaos and the degree to which that was one of the defining reasons why the Holocaust played out in the way that it did. So that's by way of prefacing this contention that America is nothing like a broken nation. In fact, what we learned from the assault on the Capitol in January and everything that came before and after it was that America's democratic institutions are deeply founded and are strong and resilient.
That's nice. I didn't hear the trumpet playing while you said that, but maybe you can put that in afterwards. Look, Stephen, those things are very nice for Americans to hear, but let's try to be a little bit realistic. There are many good things about American democracy. There's a strong civil society, right? There's some great journalists, but we have some big problems. We have very little local journalism. We have very little historical awareness. We have a constitution which allows for voter suppression, which is practiced very seriously. We have massive inequality of wealth and income, which means that people live in very different worlds. And even more than in Britain, people's politics are determined by their social media practices. We have some rather serious problems.
Tim Snyder, you find me a society that doesn't have deep structural problems. I mean, all democratic societies do in one way or another, but surely, again, the point about what happened in January is this, that even the most pro-Trump news media like Fox News in the end called Arizona and other states for Biden because they couldn't deny the truth. Look at the court system. The courts would not deny the truth and play Trump's game. They refused to. Every stage of the institutional system in the United States ultimately held. And that's why Trump's sitting in Mar-a-Lago and not in the White House.
I mean, that's a view that you can take, but if you happen to be a historian or a political scientist who works on coups, what you learn is that failed coup attempts are not good things, because failed coup attempts are what people learn from. You're right, in this particular case, the coup attempt failed, and I'm as happy as you are about it, maybe happier, but it's not something that people expected to happen, right? You spoke earlier about how one shouldn't expect things to be worse than they are. I was one of the very few people who came out in publication and said, there will be a coup attempt, there will be a violent attempt to change this outcome. And I was right, and pretty much everybody else was wrong. And there's a reason for this, which is this faith that institutions automatically work and bounce back. They don't. They only work if you care seriously about them, take them seriously, and when something happens like what just happened in January, you work hard to repair them instead of just saying, aha, everything was honky-dory.
I definitely believe it's right to take things seriously, but there is a strong body of opinion, even within history, even colleagues of yours like David Bell, respected professor of history at Princeton, who think that there's a danger in using the language you use. He says, most American voters outside of the political progressive left do not think of fascism as in any way an American phenomenon. Fascism for them is the World War II enemy, an alien foreign ideology, and to associate it with a president for whom some may even have voted seems absurd. It seems like another example of overkill on the left. Do you see where he is coming from?
No, I think Professor Bell has identified a very important problem, which is that you always think it's the other guy, right? You always think that these problems happen in other countries. There couldn't possibly be a far-right movement in my country. There couldn't possibly be domestic terrorism in my country. It's not going to happen that people carrying Confederate flags and Nazi symbols are going to storm the Capitol in my country. Professor Bell is exactly right. People don't want to think that these kinds of things happen in your country. That's what history is there for. History is there to tell you that your country is not exceptional in these ways. If you're an American historian, history is there to tell you that you had slavery, that Reconstruction failed, and that racism is a long-term tendency in the United States. That's what history is for.
But is it helpful to infer to many people who voted for Trump that they are part of a proto-fascist movement, because that is most definitely not their self-perception. And I'm going to quote to you one other historian, Thomas Weber, who's talked about trust and where America goes from here. And he says that trust can only be re-established in our America if people are not showered with false accusations. If people have supported a bumbling emperor with no clothes for the last 4 years, i.e. Trump, we will not get through to them today by calling them fascists.
Yeah, but I'm not, as you might have noticed, Stephen, I'm not doing that. What I would do, though, is say that there's an excellent point inside that quotation, which is how to reach people. I don't think you reach people either by humoring them. I think you reach people, and this goes to a problem that the UK also has, by having local sources of reliable information that aren't all about national and international politics. This is where the American discussion has gone wrong. When you let social media take over and you let local media die, you end up in this fight, this bipolar fight between one side and the other side, where the truth gets lost. So the answer is not, I think, either humoring people and saying, oh, yes, it's just fine that you think it's okay to storm the Capitol by violence or whatever. That's not going to help either, just like calling them fascists isn't going to help. This isn't a bridge party. It's not about like patting people on the head or not. Democracy depends on something much more serious than that. It depends on factuality. So if you care about democracy, you have to care about building up institutions of factuality, not about humoring people or not about calling them names.
Right, and I've heard you in the past talk about the importance of re-establishing local reputable news media. You are very upset about the demise of local newspapers across the United States, but it's very hard to see that local newspapers are going to re-emerge because the digital landscape has changed and probably changed the media landscape and the information flows across America forever. So what is your prescription for the pushback against what you call the post-truth society?
Yeah, that's a great question, because now we're getting on to serious things about how you identify problems, right? History tells you that changes precisely in media are vastly destabilizing. I mean, even the printing press was vastly destabilizing for the whole European order, and for about 150 years until people got that under control. With the internet, we don't have 150 years. If we care about democracy, we have to start from the premises that democracy is an enlightenment project. Democracy depends upon people being reasonable and having something to be reasonable with, which is facts. You can't start from saying, oh, this is an unsolvable problem, because if all these problems are unsolvable, then we can say goodbye to democracy. You have to say, what can we do?
No, but I want to hear how you build a 21st century fact-based culture and society.
Okay, first of all, you treat these enterprises as being subject to antitrust law, right? I mean, Hayek, who's not a left-winger, thinks that big monopolies like this are just as bad as central planning, and he says it's the government's role to break them up, and he's absolutely right.
Sorry, so hang on, you're talking about the big tech companies, the Facebooks and Googles.
Yes, you break them up and you tax them, you internalize the externality they're creating. The externality is fake news, lies, conspiracy theories, and so on. If you're looking at this from a democratic point of view, those are all negative externalities. You internalize them by taxing them, and you use the money to support commercial and non-commercial news production all across the country. I mean, it's something that the governments can do.
That's a major structural sort of undertaking, but in the shorter term, I'm just wondering, as an historian, whether you see Donald Trump and his allies in that particular wing of the Republican Party that might be represented by, say, Senators Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, whether you see them as an ongoing and very significant movement in America.
Look, the whole conversation hangs together. The thing that Mr. Cruz and Mr. Hawley and Mr. Trump have in common is a big lie that they told together about the outcome of the American election. And so long as you have a big lie functioning in your society, you do have a problem for your democracy. What Mr. Hawley and Mr. Cruz are now doing is fighting for the inheritance of that big lie. They want to be the people who tell the Americans that the white Americans, the Republicans, that they're the victims, that they're the ones whose votes are being stolen and so forth. So yes, so long as we have that big lie in the system, there's going to be a problem, right? And so part of your question about factuality, the answer would be there has to be serious investigation of what happened in the US from November of last year through January of this year. There has to be some kind of commission which lays that down, not just for future historians, but for citizens and for judges, so that we can have clarity about that. That will reduce the danger. It won't eliminate it, but it will reduce it.
This fight for factuality that you talk about, you talk about climate change being one of the things that most concerns you, the arguments about climate change, the truth about the science, the thing that perhaps most concerns you about the world in general today, because you say that you see in the denial of science the sort of ground being laid for the rise of new totalitarianisms across the world. Why do you make that linkage?
Okay, there are a lot of links in that chain, and I fear, Stephen, you're going to interrupt me. But first of all, it's the people who oppose climate change generally tend to be on the wrong side of all of the factuality issues, right? In terms of the causation, the thing about climate change is this. If you don't believe in it, you're not going to work against it. And if you don't work against it, or you stop other people from working against it, as the entire Trump administration did, you're going to make it worse. It's going to come harder and it's going to come faster. And if it comes harder and faster with the associated problems, for example, refugees, that's going to tend to consolidate right-wing politics, as we have seen in both Europe and the United States. So it's important to tell the truth about climate change and work on it in order to expand the time horizon of politics, to keep people from feeling desperate as though everything had to happen right now, because that's the climate in which the far right, or all forms of extremism for that matter, are going to flourish.
We have to end, and I'm going to end with this sort of, I hope it doesn't sound like a banal question, but the arc of your intellectual life seems to have been from relative optimism when you were writing books earlier in your career about how actually if you studied Eastern Europe, Belarus, Poland and other countries, you could see, you know, after the, I think, 17th century, a period when human beings found ways to live together in very positive terms. So that was one part of your career, but much more recently you seem to have a very bleak view of how human beings rub along with each other, the way they run politics, the way in which their darker impulses come to dominate. Am I right that you've left optimism behind and become something of a pessimist?
That's a kind question, Stephen. I appreciate it. But the answer is no. I mean, going back to your very first question, when you asked about public engagement, I spent a lot of the past 5 years in public, and all of it has been on the premise that working together, people can make a difference. I wouldn't travel and I wouldn't spend all this time on civil society if I didn't think that it mattered and it could make a difference. And, you know, and the things that worked out, they had to do with people setting other things aside and working really hard on election turnout, on other issues. So not really. I mean, as a historian, I have a sense of how badly things can go, and that guides me. But as a citizen, I also realize that the horizon of possibility can be better than we can imagine. I mean, history teaches both lessons, that things can be worse than we can imagine, but also that things can be better than we can imagine. And as far as my own work goes, I'm always working for the better because I believe that that matters.
Professor Tim Snyder, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for being on Hard Talk.
Pleasure was mine.
This is the BBC World Service, with one man's search for his identity.
Tony May was only a few days old when he was abandoned by the River Thames in London in 1942.
Who on earth abandoned me? What did you do that for?
He has spent his whole life wondering where he came from.
He was desperate for answers, and that really struck me.
Who knows what you might uncover?
You really are stepping into the unknown.
It's just heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking.
This sort of journey is not without its risks.
We had an awful lot of red herrings, we had an awful lot of false leads.
But now, thanks to advances in DNA testing, he has discovered more than he ever dreamt possible.
What a thing to do, to leave a baby on Victoria Penguin.
I'm Claire Bates, and I'll be telling Tony's extraordinary story.
Embankment Baby, Sunday at 14 GMT.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Justin Rowlatt. Coming up, zero carbon electricity is easy. We've got solar, wind and nuclear. No, the real climate challenge will be finding emission-free ways to make steel, cement and fertiliser. So could hydrogen be the explosive answer? Find out in Business Daily after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. Vast crowds of people in Myanmar have again filled the streets of towns and cities as part of a general strike against the military coup earlier this month. Businesses have mostly closed for the day. The military has warned protesters they're risking their lives. Police are using water cannon against protesters in the capital Naypyidaw. Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani has welcomed an announcement by NATO that has made no final decision on the withdrawal of its troops. In an interview with the BBC, Mr. Ghani called on the Taliban to show the same will to seek peace as it showed in seeking conflict. Boeing has recommended that dozens of its 777 airliners be grounded over an engine fault which sparked an emergency landing in Colorado on Saturday. A Pratt & Whitney 4000 engine caught fire and came off a United Airlines flight. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has called on the Biden administration to reopen dialogue to restore relations damaged under the leadership of Donald Trump. Mr. Wang urged Washington to remove unfair tariffs on Chinese goods. The director of Beijing's Hong Kong and Macau office has said only people considered patriots should be able to hold key posts in Hong Kong's government. Xiao Baolong said the territory's election system must be reformed to ensure this. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said he will lay out a cautious but irreversible plan to ease coronavirus lockdown restrictions in England. Schools in England are expected to reopen on the 8th of March as part of the plan. The opposition in Armenia has called for rolling acts of civil disobedience to force the country's prime minister to resign. Thousands of people took part in a demonstration in Yerevan on Saturday against the prime minister, Nikol Pashinyan. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to Business Daily. I'm Justin Rolat, and today we'll be looking at whether there is an explosive answer to the challenge of decarbonising some of the industries we all depend on. Around the world, people are already planning for a hydrogen economy.
So there's the potential for us to use all that solar and wind to produce vast quantities of hydrogen. And I think it's quite possible that we can then export around the world.
But not everyone is so optimistic.
It is inefficient to make and it is inefficient to use, and so you don't want to use it unless you really have to.
So can hydrogen replace hydrocarbons? Find out here on Business Daily on the BBC World Service.
Can you responsibly feed the world and reduce CO2 emissions? Without mineral fertilizer, the world could only feed 40% of its population. But to make mineral fertilizer, you need to rely on fossil fuels to generate the required production energy, resulting in CO2 emissions.
That's an advert by the Norwegian chemicals company Yara. We don't often talk about the carbon cost of fertilizer, but ammonia fertilizer production is responsible for 1% of global emissions and consumes almost 2% of global energy. Then there's steel, cement and glass. All these materials require the intense heat produced by burning fossil fuels, especially natural gas, and they also need to be decarbonised over the next 30 years if we're to avoid catastrophic climate change. So what if there was a different gas we could burn that didn't contain carbon?
It's bigger than I expected. So what we just did was simply put a little wooden splint underneath a party balloon filled with hydrogen. It wasn't even that big, but my God, it's loud.
Andrea Sella is a chemistry professor at University College London. Now, what is that telling us about hydrogen?
First of all, it does pack a lot of energy into small quantities. But it's also extremely fast when it reacts, and that's because hydrogen itself, the atoms are so light, which means that they move very quickly. That means that their chemical reactions are very fast. And if the reactions are fast, that means, really high power output. And it's extremely clean burning. All you get is H2O, water. It's just clouds.
You are describing to me, Andrea, an excellent fuel, aren't you?
Hydrogen is, in a sense, the dream fuel. But there is a bit of a problem. This cylinder here has about 500 grams, about half a kilo of hydrogen inside it. And what I'd like you to do is to lift it. You asked me to pick it up? Yeah, just lift it. Just lift it a little. Right. Now that is heavy. I would say
it's got to be at least probably 10 kilos at least.
Yeah, you're talking about 15 kilos for that cylinder. And this is where the great conundrum with hydrogen lies. You can only store it in compressed cylinder form. You've got to encase it in steel. The steel's got to be relatively thick. And at this point, it's much less competitive.
That's one of the main reasons why it looks like we'll be relying on batteries to replace our petrol-driven cars rather than hydrogen. But this explosive gas has one more trick up its sleeve.
So I've got a little beaker here, and I'm just going to fill it with some tap water. And what I really want to show you is a little bit of chemical magic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 paper clips, and I'm just going to hang them over the edge of the beaker. And now I'm going to connect them up with some crocodile clips to a 9-volt battery. I'm going to give it a stir. And if you look,
oh my God,
you can now see just
a stream of bubbles coming off,
pouring off. And so now what we have is potentially a very, very simple way in which we could take electricity which is generated from wind and solar through an electrolyzer to be able to generate hydrogen.
So you're saying we could have wind turbines, I don't know, in the North Sea producing hydrogen?
You could take seawater, you could split it, you could generate hydrogen, and then of course what we want is to be able to set it aside as a kind of temporary energy store until we need it, and then convert it back into electricity.
The ease with which hydrogen can be produced from renewable energy has for decades inspired dreams that one day the world could ditch fossil fuels and convert to a hydrogen-based economy. Once you have the hydrogen, you can use it to store energy for the days when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, or use it as a transport fuel, or instead of natural gas, to make stuff like fertilizer. The Norwegian company Yara plans to do just that in dusty Western Australia. It's building a plant that will make use of the plentiful sunshine and water from the Indian Ocean. In fact, Australia itself has big plans to build a hydrogen economy.
What we would like to see is a fully integrated energy ecosystem in Australia, with hydrogen as one of the major enablers.
Miranda Taylor is Chief Executive of National Energy Resources Australia, an agency sponsored by the Australian government.
Our mandate is to drive the commercialisation and scaling of energy technologies and also the transitioning of the oil and gas industry away from fossil fuels, if you like.
As part of that mandate, Miranda just unveiled a plan to sponsor 13 new hydrogen industry hubs across the country, including Yarra's ammonia plant. But how did it end up being unveiled by someone British?
A long, complicated journey that I think took me from the London School of Economics to the outback of Australia, ultimately in the resources sector here.
And what is the big announcement? Because when you look at how much money the Aussie government's putting in, it's, I don't want to belittle it, but it's only $1.85 million, isn't it? I mean, it's not like a Biden-style stimulus package, is it?
No, it most definitely isn't. But it is really the seed funding to develop the business model for a number of regional hubs emerging. So we've got 65 pilot projects across Australia now. So there's the potential for us to use all that solar and wind and other renewables that we have, as well as potentially some of our gas resources with carbon capture, if it can be proved to be economic, to produce vast quantities of hydrogen. Now, it's going to take decades because we need all of the costs to come down across the whole value chain. And, I think it's very uncertain yet exactly what the uses of hydrogen are going to, what's going to lock in ultimately, because this is very much an emerging industry.
So what do you imagine that we might be using this hydrogen for?
I think transport is an obvious one. I think in Australia, long-distance transport.
Well, because obviously in terms of smaller vehicles, cars and vans, it does look like batteries are probably going to win that battle, doesn't it?
It does. For people living in cities, absolutely yes. But, we are a very large country, and the most likely use is going to be in the heavy and long-distance transport. We have large road trains travelling across Australia. And then you start thinking about the ships that are navigating the world's oceans, consuming vast quantities of fuel. So yes, I think that is by far the most easy to justify economic opportunity for use of hydrogen. We also see hydrogen as a means for stabilising grids where you're producing a lot of renewable energy and you need a way of storing it, particularly in offshore wind.
So do you see this as an export industry for Australia?
Yes, in the first instance, it's most likely to be in the form of ammonia for fertilisers and as a carrier of hydrogen.
Now, this point is important. Making ammonia doesn't just require burning a gas to produce intense heat. The chemical ammonia itself is made by combining hydrogen with nitrogen from the air. And that means instead of using huge pressurized tanks, a ship could just transport hydrogen in the form of liquid ammonia.
It's easier and safer and probably more cost effective to convert the vessels to carry ammonia.
But obviously with those, essentially you're just taking energy, water, nitrogen. You could make that anywhere, couldn't you? Why Australia? And don't you have the disadvantage that you're relatively remote? Why wouldn't you make that closer to the market? But isn't that one of the amazing things about hydrogen is, in theory, it could be manufactured anywhere in the world?
Yeah, I don't think it'll just be Australia. But we've got offshore wind, we've got ocean energy, we've got solar, we've got land, we've got the whole thing. And then we've got all the export infrastructure in place. We will certainly be in a position to be exporting to our more local customers in Asia. And I think it's quite possible that we can then export around the world.
Lofty ambitions there from Miranda Taylor of National Energy Resources Australia. And indeed, ammonia production is an industry where the use of hydrogen is chemically indispensable. The problem is, as Miranda herself admits, when it comes to replacing fossil fuels across the rest of the global economy.
Hydrogen is going to decarbonise the sectors that other technologies, mainly direct use of electricity, cannot reach.
Michael Liebreich is the founder of Liebreich Associates, a clean energy consultancy.
The problem with hydrogen is that it is inefficient to make and it is inefficient to use. And so you don't want to use it unless you really have to, unless you can't do it directly with electricity. So if you were to drive a hydrogen car, what you'd be doing is first taking renewable electricity, throwing away half of it, making hydrogen, and then putting it into a car and throwing away more of it in inefficiencies within the car. Why not just take that electricity, stick it in the battery, and go drive somewhere?
Batteries do have one big problem, though. For a given mass, they don't carry anywhere near as much energy as either petrol or hydrogen. Miranda is pinning her hopes on long-distance transport, where the battery you need can become impractically large. So what about those Australian road trains she mentioned?
So trucks, lithium-ion batteries already are so much lighter that if you take out the drivetrain, take out the diesel engine, the gearbox, the prop shaft, the fuel tank, all of that stuff, you'll have a 500-mile truck in a few years that essentially weighs the same, but it'll be electric. That won't do thousands of miles. If you wanted to drive across America, across Australia, if you want to drive from Aberdeen to Zagreb, then you may say, well, maybe we'll consider hydrogen or fuel cells for that. But you know what? That's quite a small proportion. Not that many of them are going to be driving 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 miles, and certainly not without stopping along the way for the driver.
I mean, what about a really intractable problem like aeroplanes?
In terms of fuels, the answer might be hydrogen or what they call synthetic fuels, where you take hydrogen and you combine it with carbon, probably that you've captured from the air, and you make a liquid fuel that has got the energy density to fly long distance.
Okay, what about shipping?
So some shipping is really, really hard. Anything that goes over about 200, 250 kilometers, the amount of energy that you can put in a battery is insufficient. So we're looking at probably a solution like ammonia. You can use it in engines. The big manufacturers are all adapting engines to work on either hydrogen or ammonia, but ammonia is easier to store and move around. And you can imagine a future where we use offshore wind to produce ammonia without ever having to bring it to shore. So for any long-distance shipping, that you would sort of go off and bunker your fuel in massive offshore fuel production and refueling floating docks. So that's a kind of 2050 thing, let me put it that way.
So hydrogen could have some uses in transport, either directly or in the form of ammonia. But what about another big use of fossil fuels, especially natural gas, providing heat both in our homes and in industrial processes like making steel, glass and cement. Well, Michael says there is already a better solution: electric heat pumps.
Heat pumps are very much like your refrigerator. You use a coolant fluid and it pumps the heat out of your ice cubes and your milk and your beers and so on. So put it in reverse and it will pump heat into a process. You know, there's a lot of discussion right now about heat pumps in the home. They're more expensive than boilers, but they're super, super efficient. I've got one in my home in London. And, you know, what's particularly interesting, heat pumps could do all of the low temperature industrial heating. You know, anything up to about 250 degrees, much hotter than you would think, can actually be done using heat pumps. So even for preheats, for things like steel or cement, you'll probably use a heat pump with enormous gains and benefits in efficiency right there and then.
But what about industrial processes that require really high temperatures, like glass making, for example?
So probably we'll redesign that process around electrical heating, but it's not straightforward. You get to very high temperatures, you're going to have to use all sorts of, maybe it might be arc heating or something else, but it can be done. It's 1600 degrees, absolutely within the realms of what can be done with electricity.
So null point to hydrogen for heating, although Michael does say some of these heavy industries may still need to use hydrogen for chemical processes, such as reducing iron ore to make steel. And there is still one other big area where Michael agrees with Miranda that hydrogen could prove invaluable: long-term energy storage.
That is the real problem that we need to plan around in the UK, is the 2 weeks with no wind during winter, because solar will be of almost no use. It produces a tenth of what it produces during the summer. Batteries will be way too expensive as a solution. You can use a battery to get through a few minutes, a few hours, a day, but a couple of weeks, you've really got to go for strategic storage of a molecule. We could do this with hydrogen. We could do this with natural gas. But you've got to have something to cover that 2 week period when there's no wind and no sun.
Is there a more general problem with the robustness of energy systems? So if the grid goes down for whatever reason, we may have no available stored energy to fall back on.
Yes, I'm very worried about the resilience of where we're going. Obviously, we've always had the electrical system. What you may not know is that only covers 20% of the country's energy needs. Now, of course, what we're doing, though, is electrifying absolutely everything. All our appliances, our heating, our transport, the ambulances, the police cars, payment systems. I couldn't even pay for a pint of milk without electricity now, because I don't even carry cash. And what this means is our economy is going to be super dependent on electricity. And if we have a power cut, it becomes really life-threateningly dangerous. The issue is not just, well, there might be a few days when there's not enough wind. There's also potential cyber attacks. There's weather. We could have, a couple of interconnections taken out at the same time that we need to be thinking about strategically.
And that is where a big stockpile of hydrogen might just prove a lifesaver. Well, that's it from me. Today's producer was Lawrence Knight. Tomorrow, Tamasin Ford will be looking at whether one unexpected side of the pandemic is that it's creating a mountain of plastic waste.
Hello and welcome to Witness History from the BBC World Service with me, Alex Last, as we present more first-hand accounts of events that have shaped our world. And today we tell the story of how Swedish scientists alerted the world to the environmental threat from acid rain.
The problem of acid rain is expected to be on the agenda when the Prime Minister...
Campaign to stop acid rain.
Acid rain. Acid rain.
Acid rain.
Into what's known as acid rain.
In the 1970s and 80s, acid rain was one of the biggest environmental issues in the world, as industrial pollution had made rainwater acidic. It was having a devastating impact on the environment across Europe and North America.
Acid rain is the direct result of pollution from factories, power stations and motor vehicles that cause the disappearance of fish stocks and wildlife in lakes and rivers, the stunting of growth in crops and trees, and the erosion of stonework and other building materials, and the problem is getting rapidly worse.
But it had taken more than a century for the world to wake up to the problem. The phenomenon of acid rain was first noticed way back in the 19th century in Britain during the Industrial Revolution. acid rain is primarily caused by the burning of fossil fuels, particularly coal, which releases large amounts of sulfur dioxide, as well as some nitrogen oxides, into the air. Many of these particles mix with moisture in the atmosphere to create sulfuric and nitric acid, which then falls back to Earth as very acidic rain. But for a long time, the threat from acid rain was not taken seriously. At worst, it was seen as a local issue. Such pollution, it was believed, could not travel far. But all that changed in the 1960s, when scientists in Scandinavia tried to explain the dramatic changes they were seeing in their environment.
The most serious impact that we first experienced here in Scandinavia is the extinction of fish in many lakes. And there was observations of increasing acidity of freshwater lakes and streams.
Henning Roeder is a retired professor of chemical meteorology at Stockholm University and a pioneer of acid rain research. Back in the 1960s, he was a young PhD student studying atmospheric dynamics.
It was first seen in Scandinavia, Norway and Sweden, but a similar phenomenon was also discovered in northeastern parts of the United States and Canada.
Then in 1967, for the first time, acid rain hit the headlines when a Swedish scientist, Svante Udén, put the pieces of the puzzle together and took the unusual step of publishing his findings in a major Swedish national newspaper.
And in this article, Svante Udén took the observations of increasing acidity of lakes and streams in Sweden that he had discovered, and he connected that to observations of an increasing acidity also in the rainwater. And he suggested that this was due to large sulfur emissions in other countries, especially in the United Kingdom and Germany. And that article caused a lot of discussions in my country, in Sweden.
The idea that acid rain was causing real damage was bad enough, but the radical bit was the suggestion that it was being caused by pollution being carried on the prevailing winds from countries thousands of miles away. That was new and had major global implications. At the time, there was no proof.
When I read it, I thought that this cannot possibly be true. He must be wrong, because the general feeling about air pollution at that time was that air pollution is mainly a local phenomenon. Maybe it could affect a few tens of kilometers, but Svante Udén's suggestion was that it was traveling a few thousand kilometers. I called him up because I knew him from before. He had been working in our department. I called him up and said, interesting paper, but this cannot possibly be true. And he said, well, Henning, come and see me. So I went to his office in Uppsala, and we sat for much of a day discussing his data and his conclusions. And in the end of the day, he persuaded me that it might be true.
So Henning changed his PhD and set out to investigate if it really was possible that sulfur dioxide emissions from other countries far away were really a source of the acid rain in Scandinavia.
It turned out that he was basically right, Svante Udén. I mean, he was correct. I did some calculations, and I found that not all, but a large fraction of the sulfur, the acidifying pollutants in Scandinavia, actually originated from sources in countries far away.
Here's Henning speaking to the BBC back in the 1980s.
If I use Sweden as an example, we can estimate that on an annual basis, we receive about 10% of our sulfur from United Kingdom, another 10% from West Germany, another 10% roughly from East Germany, maybe 5% from Poland, etc., etc. And so it is really an international problem.
But his research was greeted with scepticism, especially in countries like the UK and Germany, whose industries were among the largest emitters of sulfur dioxide, as at the time Western industry and electricity generation were heavily reliant on coal.
After I published this in the early 70s, I went to a conference, a large conference in the United States, and I presented my work. I was still rather young, and at the same conference there was this famous British father of atmospheric diffusion, I could say. When he heard my presentation, he stood up and said, well, this cannot possibly be true. He just didn't believe it. Of course, I felt a little bit awkward then that the father of atmospheric transport and diffusion say that in the front of a few hundred people. But I survived and eventually turned out to be correct.
The Swedes had been complaining that our pollution, as well as Germany's, was damaging their environment. The tests showed beyond doubt that British sulphur dioxide does indeed cross the North Sea to Scandinavia.
Soon, studies started to reveal the impact of acid rain across Europe and North America, and it became a major international issue.
The Black Forest in Germany is fast becoming one of the worst affected areas.
It's a major concern in North America too. They now talk of an environmental holocaust.
Major investigations were published, and by the late 1970s there were calls for urgent action to cut sulphur dioxide emissions. But still, the biggest polluters, such as the UK, the US and Germany, dragged their feet, balking at the cost of cleaning up their coal-fired power stations.
Is it worth, in the end of the day, in order to save a few fish, but it is a few fish and rather a few lakes, of the whole of Europe, spending billions of pounds and increasing the cost of electricity through the whole of Europe, 15 or 20%? I don't know the answers to those questions, but that's the kind of question we have to try and answer. Somebody has to answer.
It took time for scientists all over Europe and all over the world to accept the facts. And it sort of paved the way for political action, and then there was a serious attempt to reduce sulfur emissions in Europe.
In the mid-1980s and 90s, politicians finally took action.
The long-running campaign to stop acid rain took a big step forward today. 21 countries in Europe and North America agreed to cut back on the chemicals that cause the problem.
The government is said to be ready to admit that Britain is partly to blame for acid rain in Norway and is prepared to do something about it.
Today, the emissions of sulfur has gone down by more than 90% compared to the 1970s, late 1970s. So it's been a real success.
But now India, Russia and China are the biggest emitters of sulfur dioxide, and air pollution remains a problem around the world, affecting the environment and the health of millions. But the campaign to end acid rain in Europe and North America shows what can be achieved if action is taken, perhaps important with the world facing climate change.
Collaboration, cooperation, dialogue between scientists and policymakers led to a very successful reduction policy. But climate change, that's our real challenge today. I mean, it's a fundamental problem. But we have to do that because otherwise we'll be in great trouble.
Professor Henning Roeder, ending this edition of Witness History with me, Alex Last. For more of our history programmes, just search online for BBC Witness History.
You're listening to the BBC World Service.
From what's going on,
a 90-year-old British woman has become the first person in the world to be given a fully tested vaccine against COVID-19.
to what can go wrong.
As the eyeball went left to right, I could hear the eyes moving and squelching.
The challenges of maintaining body and mind.
Our children's mental health is our continent's future wealth.
Health on the BBC World Service. And in 60 minutes, the cultural front line.
Directors Sharad Devrajan and Cecil Jones-Aben on telling new animated stories from India and Ghana. Plus, Latvian director Ilse Bukovska-Jacobson on the healing power of animation.
The climate question is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
The smell of fir trees on a wet, windy day.
Oh, I love that smell too.
And we're not the only ones who share a love of forests. Trees are often touted as a natural fix for climate change, absorbing planet-warming gases.
People are pinning a lot of hope on reforestation as a way of solving the climate crisis. It is indeed a way of capturing carbon, and it will mitigate the problem.
But a warming world may mean plants can't do their job as effectively.
There's a concern that at some point the biochemistry of photosynthesis won't be able to continue to sort of draw down or use the carbon dioxide as efficiently as it has been doing.
On the climate question from the BBC World Service, we're asking, are we planting too much faith in trees?
Answers after the news.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. In the largest protest since Myanmar's military seized power 3 weeks ago, hundreds of thousands of people have filled the streets in cities and towns across the country. businesses have mostly closed for the day. Images on social media show police using water cannon to disperse protesters in the capital Naypyidaw. Jonathan Head is in neighbouring Thailand.
Today's strike has been called by a new administrative organisation calling itself the General Strike Committee, but it's not clear that that strike committee is actually organising everything. Most of the organisation is local. It's done either through community leaders, through professions, through other informal groups, lots of student activists. It is remarkable, really. I mean, it's a lot more organised than when it started, and it's been very, very peaceful as well. We'll have to see how long they can keep it going, though. This is a long game. When you have a general strike like this, people are not getting any income. The banks aren't functioning anyway. They can't get cash, and there are no supplies being sold.
The Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has welcomed an announcement by NATO that has made no final decision on the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. Mr. Ghani told the BBC NATO's move would provide a window of opportunity to accelerate the peace process with the Taliban. Boeing has recommended suspending flights of its 777 aircraft powered by Pratt & Whitney 4000 engines until an inspection protocol is in place. An engine of this type caught fire and came off a United Airlines flight near Denver, Colorado on Saturday. And Japan has asked all airlines using them to avoid its airspace. Mariko Oi is in Tokyo.
The Japanese authorities have ordered Japanese carriers to stop flying that particular type of planes. That order came on Sunday, which affected 19 planes for All Nippon Airways and 13 for Japan Airlines, though both carriers have said that they haven't been using those planes much because of the pandemic. Back in December, a Japan Airlines flight from Okinawa to Tokyo had an issue with its left engine, and that involved exactly the same type of plane.
The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is to announce today that all schools in England will reopen in 2 weeks as part of his broader plan to ease coronavirus restrictions. Mr Johnson has been accused of acting too late and relaxing curbs too early last year. Here's Helen Catt.
The government says it is in a position to move to the first phase, which will begin on March the 8th. It's understood all schools will reopen to all pupils, although it's thought a few days' flexibility may be built in. Initially, the rules on meeting one other person outdoors in a public space are expected to be extended to cover sitting down for a coffee, a chat or a picnic, rather than just exercising. The rollout of Phase 1 continues on the 29th of March, when it's understood people will be able to meet outside again, including in their own gardens, in groups of 6 or as 2 households.
World News from the BBC. The top Chinese official overseeing Hong Kong has said the territory's electoral system must be reformed, so only those considered patriots can hold key positions. Xia Baolong said posts in the executive, the legislature and the judiciary must not be taken by anyone who opposed China and disrupted Hong Kong. The opposition in Armenia has called for rolling acts of civil disobedience to force the Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, to resign. They're urging protesters to block traffic and hold a general strike. They blame Mr Pashinyan for Armenia's humiliating defeat in a recent war with Azerbaijan. Here's our Caucasus correspondent, Rayhan Dimitri.
The most stinging issue for Nikol Pashinyan is the fate of the dozens of prisoners of war. The exchange of prisoners of war was one of the key points in this truce agreement, but there are still dozens of Armenian servicemen being held by Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is saying they were captured after the end of hostilities in November and therefore don't qualify as prisoners of war. But that is a very difficult issue for Pashinyan because he did promise that that issue will be resolved.
The UN Refugee Agency has called for the rescue of a group of Rohingya refugees adrift in a boat in the Andaman Sea without food or water. It said it understood that some refugees had died and others were ill. The passengers said they left the southern Bangladesh coast around 10 days ago and suffered engine failure. A court in western India has granted bail to the prominent activist Varavara Rao on medical grounds. The Mumbai High Court agreed with Mr Rao's lawyer that the prison had inadequate facilities to treat the 81-year-old. The Maoist ideologue has been in jail since 2018 for allegedly inciting caste violence. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to the Climate Question from the BBC World Service. From the science to the politics, We're your guide to the burning issue of our time. I'm Neil Rizal.
And I'm Greg Jackson, and today we're in the woods. Trees, we love them. They're places of reflection, relaxation, and romance. I'm in an English wood near my home that I love going for muddy walks in.
Well, I'm in a forest by my place off Canada's Pacific coast. You might be able to hear the sea there in the background. I love this place. I bring my family here every chance I get.
Politicians and big businesses love trees too. They're seen as a natural fix to climate change because they eat carbon dioxide, one of the main gases that cause global warming.
Shell, an oil company, just promised to offset its emissions in part by planting trees.
Yeah, Nestle too. The food giant says it will put hundreds of millions of them in the ground over the next decade.
American cities and corporations plan to plant 800 million trees by 2030.
And even countries are getting on board too. Pakistan, for example, wants to plant more than 3 billion trees in the next couple of years.
And it all sounds great, right? Trees everywhere, sprouting up like fists in the face of climate change.
But our love of trees could be blinding us to an uncomfortable truth. There are signs that they may be capturing way less carbon than we thought.
So our climate question is, are we putting too much faith in trees?
Shut down right on time. 1.4 by 103.6.
To help us see the woods for the trees, we've gone to space.
1.4 by 103.6.
My name is Ben Poulter. I'm a research scientist at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, which is located just outside of Washington, D.C.
Okay, not quite space, but he does study trees using satellites.
Do we know how many trees there are?
There's a recent estimate of 3 trillion trees.
Is that number going up or down in recent years?
Most likely it's going down. Deforestation continues, and unfortunately the rates of deforestation continue to increase.
So where in the world are they disappearing? Where are the hotspots?
So pretty much everywhere.
Oh, that's depressing.
That's not the answer we're looking for.
This is a really important point because despite all those high-profile tree planting campaigns, our forests are actually declining. So there's something called net forest loss.
That's the difference between the area we're cutting and the area we're planting.
And when you do the maths, we've lost nearly 5 million hectares of forest every year since 2010. That's the size of Costa Rica or Slovakia gone every single year.
The main hotspots of deforestation continue to be in the tropics, so the Amazon basin, Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru, and then Southeast Asia, for example, Indonesia.
Well, before we go to the hotspots, let's talk about trees themselves and what they do for climate change. What are the trees like where you are, Greta?
Oh, they are beautiful. The sun is just starting to set, so the light is beautiful and golden and dappling on all the trees around me. They're really old, over 3 centuries, some of them. And I'm actually looking at one right in front of me. It's a beech tree. It's pretty naked at the moment with no leaves on, it being winter, but it's still spectacular, maybe 30 meters high.
Wow. Well, here, I don't know if you can hear it, but there's a bit of rain following. This is part of a great rainforest that stretches from Alaska to California. And the fir tree I'm next to is more than 500 years old. And if I put a hand on it and walk around, which I'm doing now, whoa, it will, there's snow, sorry. It takes me 19 paces, still going, to get all the way around this tree.
19! Oh, that's hard to imagine how big it is.
It's amazing. So let's talk about the connection between trees and climate change.
So we want to keep global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5, to avoid the worst effects. And that means drastically curbing our emissions and, really importantly, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Right, so 2 things there. Stop pumping it into the sky and get the CO2 that's already there out.
Yeah, and we need to try and get 730 billion tonnes of the stuff out of the sky, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC for short.
If you put your hand on that number and walked around it, I suspect it would be more than 19 paces. It's a big number, right?
Yeah, it's huge. I'd say it would take me all year to walk around it.
Right.
It's the same as all the CO2 emissions by the US, UK, Germany and China since the Industrial Revolution.
Whoa.
And so, trees, what do?
Go on.
They pull CO2 from the air to create food.
They eat it.
Yeah.
Could they eat our way out of climate change?
Not entirely, but they could chew away a good chunk of it. So the IPCC says that as much as a quarter of CO2 could be captured by boosting the world's forests and woody savannas. And that means adding 24 million hectares of trees every year until 2030. That's about the size of the UK every single year.
Good thing tree planting's popular.
I think it really hit me when in one day I noticed that tree planting projects were being advertised on my tea bags, my toilet roll and in a national newspaper. And I suddenly realised that this has grabbed the public attention and there's a lot of interest in it.
This is Dr. Kate Hardwick. She works for the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in the UK, which is famous for its beautiful gardens as well as its scientific research.
And what did you think when you saw that? You're looking at your paper, the loo roll, and your tea bags. What's going through your mind?
Well, first of all, I was delighted. And then our director at Kew organised a group of international scientists to write a paper on reforestation. And it was only really when I started researching for that I kind of realised that reforestation isn't always what you might think it would be.
Right, so when I think of reforestation, I think of beautiful big trees with ferns underneath and lots of wild animals running around. So What is it when you say it might not be what you think?
Yeah, so I think that's what most people assume, is that by reforestation, you assume that you're trying to put back the forest exactly as it was before. And there are some fantastic examples of that being the case. But in many cases, it isn't.
One well-cited paper says that only a third of pledged areas for forests will be like the ones that you and I are in, Neil, natural. The rest will be plantations or agroforestry, by which I mean combining trees and agriculture together.
So it all comes down to what you mean by the word forest.
There certainly isn't a global definition. I think each initiative will have their own definition.
Can you paint a picture for us of what these different types of forests would look like? I guess like a natural forest versus a plantation versus agroforestry. In TV it'd be very easy. We would just put up some pictures. Yeah. But what's the difference?
Well, of course, it depends entirely on where you are in the world. So there's a huge range of what it would look like. So if you were looking at a tropical rainforest, you're looking at basically a sort of complex habitat full of literally hundreds of different tree species, multiple layers, undergrowth and understory trees, and then a dense canopy with emergent trees coming out of the top, full of wildlife, and just a vast diversity of plant and animal, insect and fungal species. Whereas in comparison, in a lot of the tropical countries, they favour eucalyptus as a fast-growing commercial crop, because they put on metres a year and tend to be rows of single species, often very little or no understory in between, because the plantation manager would want to clear that away because it would compete with the trees.
Does it matter whether we have plantations or natural forests?
Yes, one study has shown that natural forests can capture up to 40 times more carbon than commercial plantations.
40 times is such a staggering difference. Why are plantations so awful at sucking up carbon?
The reason for that huge difference is partly because of the long-term intention of a commercial plantation is to cut it down. So obviously at that point, most of the carbon will be lost.
Of course, if you use the wood to build things like furniture or homes, that holds the carbon longer than if you simply burn it for firewood.
But the bigger picture here is that natural forests capture more carbon than plantations. And that's also in part because trees lock up carbon underground.
In the soil?
In the soil.
These natural habitats, they often capture a huge amount of carbon in the soil. So if carbon capture is your main objective, then tree planting will disturb the soil, you'll get erosion, it will change the microenvironment of the soil, the acidity, and carbon is likely to be lost.
And the soil is disturbed twice, when the trees are planted and then when the trees are taken away. So really, we want trees to stay in the ground.
But we do need to be planting more, so we need to think about where we can get the best bang for our tree planting buck. Is there a best place?
This is sort of a holy grail type of question.
You are from NASA, though, so we're expecting a good answer.
It's become quite controversial because there's lots of ways scientifically that we can sort of do these assessments. And I think the consensus that emerges is that the tropics would be sort of the first priority in terms of tree planting, partly because the trees are going to grow much quicker in the tropics than if you plant one up by the Arctic Circle or something, but partly because of the biodiversity benefits that you get, and then partly because restoring forests in the tropics also can have significant benefits for sort of local livelihoods and providing hydrologic benefits and so on.
Involving the community is critical to the success of any planting project, says our next guest, Professor Pedro Brancaleon. He's a restoration ecologist from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil.
When reforestation projects are implemented without enough participation or careful planning, we may create problems to these people, these local people. And if they have problems, sometimes they may simply burn the area that was recently reforested.
Has that really happened, that locals have burned down a reforested area?
Yes, it is common. So
common?
I would give common. Yeah, it's common. And that's why we need to integrate people in these projects.
Why might they be doing that, you may wonder? Well, for instance, he says farmers might be using what looks like vacant land as pasture. Then tree planters will come and fence it off one day without so much as a hello. It doesn't go down well.
But having the locals on side is not the only thing you need to see the long-term benefits. Pedro sees lots of projects fail because once the trees are in the ground, the momentum just disappears. And planting a sapling is really just the beginning.
So it seems that all the enthusiasm and unfortunately the funding finishes when the trees are planted. But it's like abandoning a baby in the jungle, you know. The trees planted in an area is just a baby. He or she needs to be protected.
Why is that? Why is it that we seem to love the planting of trees, but we're not as keen to invest in the caring for them?
Yeah, tree planting today has been heavily pushed as a kind of global enthusiasm. And you know, when people get enthusiastic about things, they invest a lot of energy at the beginning and then they get bored very easily.
Pedro tells us that once the photo op is done, people and their money go. And lots of these saplings end up dying.
And Kate tells us that in some instances, humans should just butt out of tree planting altogether.
Wherever possible, allow nature to heal itself and to promote natural forest regeneration. In many situations, forests can actually restore themselves really quickly and certainly more cheaply and more effectively than humans could ever dream of doing.
In a world where we're being told there's a climate emergency, we have to act now, we have to do something, that seems almost counterintuitive to kind of leave it to the birds and the squirrels.
Yeah, it's a really interesting viewpoint. I think it's a very human viewpoint. I think it's a natural human reaction to think that if you want something done quickly, you can then do it yourself. But in sites which are suitable for natural regeneration, it can happen incredibly quickly and better. So there are many examples of tree planting where the trees have been planted and then when you go back a few years later, most of them have died.
Ray, do you think the trees around us might have some thoughts on that?
Very diplomatic.
On climate change, what's the balance between, how much should we be protecting existing trees and older trees to planting new? Where should our energies be put?
Yeah, today I think we clearly need to put energy on both kinds of intervention. But in terms of hierarchy of interventions, I think it's more priority to protect existing forests. Because, for instance, when you clear a forest land, when you deforest an area, you suddenly emit all of that carbon that is stored on the forest in one day. In one day, you can just release the carbon that took centuries to accumulate in an Amazonian forest, for instance. One day is enough. But then when you want to bring back all of this carbon, you may have to wait for 100 years. So it is intelligent to avoid losing all of this carbon before bringing more carbon to the forest. But today we don't have the option of one or another. Both interventions are essential because we don't have time to lose or too much time to wait.
So we've got to be protecting and planting.
We need to plant faster and be planting the right kinds of forest, like the ones we're in right now, right, Crea? Letting forests spread naturally where possible.
I mean, given how much we know about this and how important our natural forests are, what do you think's stopping us from acting on that knowledge?
I think it's partly a question of old habits die hard, and forests have been seen for hundreds of years as a source of timber, and we've only just gradually begun to realise that they provide a whole range of other benefits that in the past we've either not been aware of or we've taken for granted. But people now do